I never thought that the person I trusted most in my life could destroy everything in one fell swoop. I always believed my sister, Mara, was my closest ally, the one who had my back through every hardship. That belief was shattered when she spun a web of lies accusing me of selling drugs, a crime I never committed, and got me kicked out of the only home I'd ever known. I'm writing this now as a way to document every twisted betrayal and every calculated step I took toward my final, irreversible revenge. And let me be clear, betrayal is unforgivable, and neither will I ever grant pardon for what she did. When I was a kid, Mara and I were inseparable. Growing up in a modest household, our parents did their best, even if we didn't always feel loved. Mara always took it upon herself to protect me from bullies at school and to share whatever little we had. I admired her resilience and her cunning ability to manipulate situations to our advantage. That bond, however, was built on illusions, a facade Mara maintained until the day she chose self-interest over family loyalty. I remember that fateful afternoon with unnerving clarity. I had just returned from a part-time job at a local diner, tired but proud of earning my own money. My mother greeted me with a warm smile as I stepped through the door, and for a brief moment, I felt that sense of belonging I'd craved since childhood. But that fleeting moment was ripped away by Mara's shrill laughter echoing down the hall. I didn't understand what was happening until I overheard her on the phone, her voice icy and detached as she recounted details that painted me as a dealer, a criminal who had been peddling drugs behind everyone's backs. The next morning, my life turned into a nightmare. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon the police were at our door. My parents, blinded by Mara's lies and the overwhelming pressure of scandal, decided that I was too much of a liability to keep around. I was forced out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a broken heart. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, and I knew I had to survive alone. I carried the shame and the bitterness with me, each day feeding the resolve that I would someday have my revenge. The first few months on the streets were brutal. I moved from one odd job to another, scrubbing floors and working late nights just to keep a roof over my head. The loneliness was overwhelming, and every time I thought of Mara's cold betrayal, my stomach churned with a dark mix of sorrow and anger. I spent countless nights planning how I could reclaim the power that was so cruelly stolen from me. I wasn't just going to forgive or forget. I was going to make her pay, and I'd do it in a way that ensured she'd never see me coming. My break came when I found work as a mechanic at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a sense of control over my life. Over time, I started to reconnect with old friends who knew the real me, not the criminal my sister had painted me as. They reminded me of my worth and fueled my determination to rise above the darkness Mara had thrust upon us all. I began saving every spare dollar, meticulously planning my return, not to the family that had shunned me, but to a version of life where I could rewrite my story on my own terms. In the midst of my personal resurrection, life threw another curveball. My mother fell gravely ill. It was a slow descent into a state of debilitating weakness that robbed her of the ability to care for herself. News of her sickness spread quickly, and soon my estranged parents were begging me to come home. They claimed remorse, tears welling in their eyes as they recounted the empty nights and the echoing silence of the house since I'd left. But I knew better. Their sudden change of heart reeked of convenience, a way to cling to the life they once had without confronting the lies that had cost me everything. I agreed to visit, not out of forgiveness or reconciliation, but because I needed to see for myself how far my parents had fallen. The day I drove back, a maelstrom of emotions threatened to overwhelm me. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside, the betrayal churned like a dark storm. I arrived at the house to find it in a state of disarray, a once warm home now reduced to a shell of regret and bitter memories. My father looked older, his once stern face now lined with remorse and defeat. My mother lay in a hospital bed, frail and haunted by memories of happier days. The reunion was awkward and laced with silent accusations. My parents explained, between choked sobs and stuttering apologies, how they had been manipulated by Mara's lies. They painted me as the innocent victim, a scapegoat who had been punished for crimes he did not commit. But I saw right through their facades. Their pleas were not born from genuine remorse. They were desperate attempts to erase the past and reclaim the security of family unity. And I had long since learned that loyalty must be earned, and trust once broken is never fully restored. For weeks, I oscillated between visiting my ailing mother and keeping my distance from the toxic environment that my parents had created. Every time I looked into my mother's eyes, I felt a pang of guilt and regret for what had happened. But the thought of Mara, the cold, calculating saboteur of my life, kept the fire of vengeance burning inside me. I spent long nights strategizing, piecing together every moment of evidence that would expose her lies for what they were, the desperate machinations of someone unwilling to accept their own shortcomings. I began by tracking down the few people who had known Mara long before she turned into the person capable of such deceit. Old friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives provided me with fragments of a narrative that was entirely different from the one she had spun. They spoke of a girl who was always desperate for attention, who envied the affection our parents lavished on me. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged. Mara had always resented me for being the golden child, the one who inadvertently overshadowed her. Her lies about my involvement in drugs were nothing more than a twisted attempt to reclaim the spotlight, even if it meant destroying me in the process. Armed with this knowledge, I set out to gather undeniable evidence of her deceit. I contacted the police officer who had first taken my statement, the one who had dismissed my protests as the delusions of a wayward youth. Through discreet inquiries and careful research, I uncovered records that proved my innocence, receipts, witness statements, even surveillance footage from the diner where I had worked. Every piece of evidence was meticulously collected, forming a damning portfolio against Mara. The more I learned, the more my resolve hardened. I was no longer a victim. I was an avenger, and my mission was clear. I spent countless sleepless nights poring over the details, connecting dots that pointed directly at Mara's betrayal. The evidence was irrefutable, and it was time to act. I reached out to an old contact who had since become a reputable journalist, someone who had a knack for digging up the dirt on corrupt individuals. I laid everything out on the table, every lie, every manipulation, every shattered piece of trust. My story was raw, unfiltered, and brimming with the kind of evidence that would force even the most stone-hearted skeptics to take notice. The article that eventually hit the newsstands was explosive. Mara's carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of hard facts and testimonies. As the story unfolded in front of the public's eyes, Mara's reputation disintegrated, and she found herself isolated and discredited. I watched from a safe distance, satisfaction welling up inside me as the world learned the truth about the woman who had once been my sister. The once adoring public turned its back on her, and the lies that had once sustained her power evaporated into nothingness. But revenge is never a one-time act. It is a process, a series of calculated moves that leave no room for forgiveness. Mara, desperate and broken, tried to salvage what little dignity she had left by apologizing to my parents, attempting to weave her way back into the remnants of our family. I attended one such gathering at our childhood home, the place where memories both sweet and bitter converged in every crevice. The atmosphere was heavy with the stench of regret and stale apologies. My father's voice trembled as he implored for forgiveness, his eyes pleading for a return to the old days. But I had moved on from that naive yearning for familial unity. I wasn't there to mend broken bonds. I was there to witness the final collapse of her false reality. I confronted Mara in front of everyone. My voice, cold and unwavering, recounted every lie, every betrayal, every calculated act of treachery she had ever committed. I laid bare the evidence, each word a hammer blow against the fragile facade she had built over the years. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension and disbelief. For the first time in years, I saw a glimmer of remorse in her eyes, an acknowledgement of the irreversible damage she had caused. But remorse is a luxury I could no longer afford. Her betrayal was unforgivable, and no amount of regret could ever justify the ruin she had unleashed upon me. The fallout was swift. The media, now armed with undeniable proof of Mara's deceit, descended upon her like vultures. Her reputation was irreparably tarnished, and even our parents could no longer hide behind the veil of her lies. They pleaded for another chance, for the restoration of a family that had once been whole. But I knew that trust, once shattered beyond repair, is a mirror that can never be put back together. I had already taken the first step in reclaiming my life, and there was no turning back. Every day that passed, I grew stronger, more determined to forge a future free of the venom that Mara had instilled in our lives. I channeled my pain and anger into rebuilding everything that had been taken from me. I enrolled in night classes to finish my education, started a small business repairing cars, and gradually built a network of genuine friends who valued truth over pretense. Each milestone was a small victory, a silent rebuke to the people who had once cast me aside. I learned that true strength is born out of adversity, and that the sweetest revenge is not the destruction of your enemy, but the reclamation of your own dignity and power. As months turned into years, I became a different person, a person who had endured unimaginable betrayal and emerged victorious, scarred, but unbowed. I rarely crossed paths with Mara again. When I did, it was in passing, in the silent acknowledgement that the past was unchangeable and that some wounds are too deep to ever fully heal. I watched her spiral further into isolation, her desperate attempts to regain what she had lost met with cold indifference by those who once admired her. In her downfall, I found a grim satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served in a way that was both ruthless and fair. The final blow came unexpectedly. One quiet afternoon, as I was closing up my workshop, I received an anonymous message, a link to a video file. With cautious curiosity, I watched as the camera panned over a decrepit apartment building. There, in a shadowed room, was Mara, isolated and alone, speaking in a halting voice about regrets and lost opportunities. The video was raw, unedited, and a final testament to the person she had become. It was evidence of her self-destruction, a bitter epilogue to the life she had ruined by betraying her own flesh and blood. I didn't feel the need to respond or to seek closure from her apologies. The revenge had been complete long before that day, and I had no interest in reopening wounds that I had fought so hard to close. Now, as I write these words, I know that some may call my actions ruthless or unforgiving. But betrayal leaves scars that time can never erase, and sometimes the only way to reclaim your life is to let those who wronged you face the consequences of their own actions. I have no illusions about the past or the people I once loved. I have learned that trust, once betrayed, is a luxury I can no longer afford. The price of betrayal is steep, and no apology or fleeting moment of regret can ever restore what has been lost. In the end, my journey was never about seeking forgiveness from a family that had abandoned me. It was about finding the strength to stand on my own, to rise above the ashes of deceit and rebuild my life brick by brick. I transformed my pain into power, my sorrow into success, and my anger into the fuel that drove me to reclaim my identity. The memories of that betrayal, though haunting, now serve as a reminder of how far I have come and how much I have overcome. I often wonder if Mara ever truly understood the magnitude of her actions. Did she realize that her lies not only cost me my home, but nearly destroyed the very essence of who I was? I doubt it. Her mind was too clouded by jealousy and the need for attention to grasp the irreversible damage she had wrought. And even if she did, that realization came too late. The chain reaction of events, my expulsion from the family, the loss of trust, the painful isolation, had already set the stage for a downfall that would spare no one from facing harsh truths. Now, as I continue to build a life defined by resilience and hard-won victories, I look back on that period with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the lost time and the broken family, and relief that I was able to reclaim my life and forge a path forward. There is no comfort in forgiveness when trust is irreparably damaged. There is only the cold, hard satisfaction of knowing that you have overcome the worst of humanity. And in my case, that satisfaction came in the form of a well-executed, silent revenge, a reminder that those who betray you will eventually have to live with the consequences of their choices. This is my story, raw and unfiltered, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, even in the face of betrayal and unimaginable loss. I share it not to evoke pity, but to serve as a warning. Betrayal is a path with no return, and the price you pay is often far greater than you can ever imagine. I stand here today, not as a victim, but as a survivor, someone who has turned every bitter tear into a stepping stone towards a future defined by truth, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to justice. Mara's name, once whispered in our home with an air of familiarity, is now a byword for treachery, a symbol of the darkness that can reside in even the most unexpected places. I have no wish to see her again, no desire to reconcile the shattered pieces of a past that was never meant to be whole. Instead, I move forward with my head held high, each day a silent testament to the fact that true strength is not measured by forgiveness, but by the courage to rebuild, to rise, and to let the scars of betrayal serve as a permanent reminder that some wounds are simply too deep to ever be mended. My life is now defined by a series of hard-earned victories, a modest workshop, a small circle of loyal friends, and the quiet knowledge that I have taken control of my destiny. Every morning, as I drive to work, I pass by the remnants of the house I once called home, and I'm reminded of the painful lesson I learned. Never allow someone's lies to dictate your future. I chose to let my past fuel my ambition rather than derail it. And in that choice, I discovered that revenge, when executed with precision and without mercy, is not about destruction. It's about reclaiming what was once stolen. I share this story to remind anyone who has been betrayed by someone they loved that you have the power to rise above the darkness. I never forgave Mara, and I never will. But in doing so, I found a strength I never knew I possessed, a strength that allowed me to transform my pain into purpose. The scars of betrayal will always be a part of me, but they no longer define me. Instead, they serve as a reminder that even in the most treacherous of times, you can carve out a future where you are in control, where the echoes of deceit are drowned out by the sound of your own resolve. I am not asking for sympathy or redemption. I am simply stating the truth. Betrayal is unforgivable, and the path to reclaiming your life is paved with unwavering determination, ruthless precision, and the refusal to let anyone else dictate your worth. Mara's lies may have set off a chain of events that nearly destroyed me, but in the end, they also forged me into the person I am today. A person who knows that revenge is not an act of anger, but a necessary step toward reclaiming one's life and identity. This is the story of how I was betrayed, how I rebuilt my life from the ruins of deception, and how I ultimately found a measure of justice in a world that often seems all too willing to let lies prevail. I hope that in sharing my journey, those who have suffered similar betrayals may find the strength to stand up, to fight back, and to realize that while some wounds never fully heal, they can serve as the foundation for a future built on truth, resilience, and the unbreakable will to survive. In the end, I'm still here, scarred, yes, but also stronger and wiser than I ever thought possible. The lessons I learned in those dark days have become the pillars upon which I now stand. And while I will never forget the treachery that Mara inflicted upon me, I have learned to live with it, not as a burden, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living a life that no amount of betrayal can ever tarnish. I'm not the kind of person who picks fights with family. Maybe that was my first mistake. I've always believed in second chances, especially when it comes to people you've known your entire life. But my sister Lauren made me realize I had to toughen up if I ever hoped to maintain any self-respect. She's younger by 3 years, and I spent the majority of my life trying to smooth out her troubles, whether it was helping her with homework or convincing our parents to be lenient when she messed up. I guess you could say I was her shield, a role I fell into because it seemed like she always needed saving from something. When Lauren moved in with me after losing her job, I didn't think twice. She called me in tears, telling me she had been fired from her 3rd job in a row. I didn't ask for details. I just told her to come stay with me until she could figure out her next step. I figured it might last a few weeks, maybe a month. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom condo that I'd purchased after years of careful saving, so there was enough space. My job paid decently, not lavishly, but enough that I could handle the mortgage on my own. I told her she could stay as long as she needed, and I wouldn't charge her a penny for rent. In exchange, I expected her to at least look for a new job so she could start getting her life on track again. In the beginning, it felt fine. She arrived with her suitcases, looking distraught and exhausted, and I gave her the spare bedroom. I remember handing her the key with a smile, telling her this was her home now. She hugged me, tears in her eyes, promising she wouldn't take advantage of my generosity. She said she'd do whatever it took to contribute. I told her I believed her. Maybe I wanted to believe she would really try. I stocked the fridge with groceries. I tidied up. I showed her where everything was and joked that she should at least try not to blow up my kitchen if she decided to cook. She laughed, and it felt like we had a genuine, sisterly moment. We talked about old times, about how we both loved reading detective novels and used to share them under the covers as kids. We talked about TV shows we might watch together. It seemed like a chance to bond again. After a week, though, I noticed she wasn't really doing much. She spent hours on my couch, scrolling through social media or watching random shows. She'd leave dishes in the sink, forgetting to clean them up. I'd come home after a long day at work, stepping on crumbs in the living room, noticing piles of laundry undone. It wasn't a war zone, but it was the kind of mess that built up slowly, day by day. I tried to be patient, though. I knew she was depressed about losing her job, and I told myself she just needed time. I started cooking dinner after work, and she'd eat with me, sometimes thanking me, sometimes just grunting approval. We'd watch a show afterward, and I'd ask if she'd sent out any job applications that day. She always had an excuse. "I will tomorrow," or "I applied to a few, but they haven't gotten back to me yet," or "I'm still updating my resume." I let it slide week after week, thinking that as long as she was safe, we'd figure something out. But it kept going, and my frustration slowly simmered. I tried to remind her she had to do more than just sit around. I'd come home and nudge her. "Hey, have you looked into those listings I forwarded you?" She'd shrug and say she'd do it later. Meanwhile, I handled every bill, every errand, every grocery run. She'd occasionally mention how bored she was, how she felt stuck and unmotivated. I tried to encourage her, telling her I'd help with interview practice or drive her to meetings if it helped, but there always seemed to be a reason why it wasn't the right day to apply or why that particular job didn't sound good. 3 months passed, then 4, and I started to feel used. Maybe that sounds harsh, but it's the truth. I'd go to bed exhausted, trying to keep my own life afloat while she slept until noon. She rarely even offered to do something as simple as running a vacuum over the carpet. I'd drop hints like mentioning how the living room was looking messy or how the laundry hamper was overflowing, but she'd nod and then do nothing. Eventually, I told her outright that she needed to step up. She acted offended, said she was going through a rough patch, and that I was lucky to be stable enough not to understand. I should have kicked her out when she started dating some random guy she met on a dating app without even telling me she was seeing anyone. She'd disappear in the evenings, coming back late, ignoring the housework even more. I asked how her job search was going, and she just rolled her eyes. Then, out of nowhere, she announced she was in a serious relationship. She'd known the guy for a month, and they were suddenly inseparable. His name was Travis, and he worked as a manager at some retail store. I met him once, briefly, when he came over to pick her up. He was polite in a rushed way, like he didn't really want to be there. I tried to be friendly, but I could sense he just wanted to leave. After that, Lauren became secretive. She'd text on the couch, giggling and smirking at her phone, ignoring me. I didn't mind her having fun, but it annoyed me that she was still contributing nothing to our household. Whenever I asked if she'd made progress on her job applications, she'd shrug and say she was working on it. I was starting to feel like the world's biggest doormat, but I was hesitant to be harsh. She was my sister, after all. Family helps family, right? Then, one day, she marched out of her room with a huge grin and told me she was engaged. I nearly dropped my mug. She'd only been dating Travis for a few months at that point. I asked if she was sure, and she got defensive, telling me she was an adult and she knew what she wanted. She held up her phone, showing off a photo of a ring. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it sparkled enough to draw attention. I tried to be happy for her, but my skepticism must have shown on my face because she immediately accused me of being unsupportive. I tried to explain that I just wanted to make sure she was certain, but she stormed off, claiming I was trying to ruin her special moment. I didn't think the worst would happen. I hoped we'd talk it out once she cooled down. But that very evening, she packed a small bag and left to stay with Travis. I didn't complain because I thought this might finally be her chance to get a fresh start. I figured she'd text me soon and we'd make up. Instead, a few days passed and my messages to her went unanswered. My calls went to voicemail. I tried to check her social media, but it looked like she'd blocked me. For a moment, I thought maybe it was some kind of glitch, but then I got a text from my mom telling me Lauren said I was unsupportive and that she needed space. Apparently, she told everyone in the family that I was jealous of her engagement, that I was giving her attitude, and that I hadn't been kind during her toughest times. I was furious. The nerve to claim I was the one who hadn't been kind after I'd housed and fed her for months. But the final blow came when I realized she wasn't just ignoring me. She was trying to frame me as the bad guy to our parents. She told them I'd pressured her to leave and that I'd made her feel unwelcome. She told them I criticized her relationship with Travis and acted like she'd never find a husband who'd want her. None of this was remotely true. I was livid. I wanted to call her and scream, but it dawned on me that she wasn't interested in clarifying anything. She had effectively shut me out. I tried to explain the truth to our parents, but they were hesitant to take sides. My mom said something about how we both needed to calm down. My dad just said he loved us both, but wished we'd stop fighting. I realized Lauren had closed ranks, isolating me with her lies. At first, I thought about letting it go, waiting for her to come to her senses. But then I found out Lauren and Travis were planning to move into a new apartment downtown. They bragged about how it was going to be a huge upgrade from my place, about how they were going to live in style. My parents hinted that Lauren was excited to decorate. I started getting calls from extended family members, congratulating Lauren on her engagement and asking me why I was making things difficult. I was dumbfounded. I'll be honest, my anger took a back seat to a kind of sadness. I felt betrayed. My own sister had used me for free room and board, then thrown me aside as soon as she found someone else to latch onto. Then she lied about what had happened, painted me as the villain, and blocked me. It stung in a way I hadn't expected. But after a while, the sadness morphed into a cold determination. I wasn't going to beg for her attention or plead with her to tell the truth. If she wanted to smear my name, fine, but I wasn't going to let her waltz into a dreamy new life without any consequences. Some people might call it petty. I call it the only way I could get closure. I still had some of Lauren's mail and personal documents at my place, including a few credit card bills and bank statements she'd been careless about. She never officially changed her address, which meant letters kept arriving. I never opened them at first because it wasn't my business. But after everything she did, I became very interested in learning about her situation. I noticed a pattern of overdue statements. She had a habit of racking up charges and only paying the minimum. I also found some job notices that stated she'd been denied positions because of poor references. None of that was surprising, but it gave me an idea. Travis might have been able to cover rent on his own, but that new downtown apartment was bound to be pricey. I started wondering if Travis knew the full extent of Lauren's financial habits. If he didn't, he was in for a nasty surprise once the bills started piling up. Still, I didn't just want to wait for them to implode. I wanted to give them a little push. I found an old contract from a short-term loan place she'd used. She had apparently used me as a reference once, forging my name on a form. I saw my fake signature at the bottom, confirming her employment status. That was the final straw. I reached out to an old friend of mine, Karen, who worked in a financial consulting firm. I didn't feed her any lies. I just told her the truth. My sister had used my name without my permission, and I suspected she was engaged in some sketchy money moves. I asked hypothetically what would happen if a prospective landlord or lender saw this. Karen told me that it would be a huge red flag. People who commit fraud, even minor fraud, often get flagged in background checks. If Lauren tried to sign a lease with a fancy management company, it might raise alarms if they did a thorough check. But I still needed a link to ensure the management got the right information. I asked Karen if she knew anyone who worked in downtown leasing offices. Turns out she had a contact who managed multiple properties, including the building I suspected Lauren was eyeing. I was discreet. I asked Karen to pass along a warning that certain applicants might try to use fraudulent references or documents. I didn't have to name names. I just hinted that if a woman with a certain set of background details applied, the landlord should be extra vigilant. I gave the approximate credit score range I saw from her statements. I also mentioned the short-term loan fiasco. That was enough for Karen's friend to keep an eye out. If Lauren and Travis applied to that building, they'd be scrutinized more carefully. I didn't think it would necessarily sabotage them, but I wanted them to sweat. And if they did get approved, well, it wouldn't be long before the rent fell behind. Meanwhile, I still had Lauren's keys to my place. She never asked for them back. One day, she showed up unexpectedly while I was at work, gathered most of her things, and vanished again. That was it. She didn't even text me afterward to say she was done picking up her stuff, but she left behind a box of random items, including some official documents. I decided to hold on to them, partly out of spite, partly because I figured if she wanted them badly enough, she'd have to talk to me. She never did. That silence fueled me even more. She was acting like I no longer existed. Fine, I thought. Let me make sure you feel my presence in your new life. When I heard through the grapevine that Lauren and Travis signed the lease on the downtown apartment, I was surprised they managed it. Maybe Travis's credit was enough to balance out Lauren's. Maybe the landlord didn't dig deep enough. Regardless, they moved in. She posted pictures on social media, flaunting the skyline view, tagging new furniture and fancy decor. She still had me blocked, but I saw it through our mom's phone. It was like she was intentionally rubbing it in. "Look how much better my life is without you," her posts seemed to say. But I also picked up on something else. Travis was working extra shifts. And Lauren still hadn't mentioned a new job. I wondered how long they could keep this up. A month later, I got a call from a debt collector asking for Lauren. I explained she no longer lived with me, but I was curious about the nature of the debt. The collector couldn't reveal details, but I gleaned enough to know they were on her trail. I decided to be helpful. I gave them her new address, which I'd overheard from family members who had visited. Maybe that was ruthless. I didn't care. She could have at least had the courtesy to tie up her financial loose ends before skipping off to her new life. If they wanted to chase her down, that was her problem. I was simply passing along accurate information. Eventually, I found out from a cousin that Lauren had been bragging about how Travis was going to pay for everything until she found the perfect job. She insisted she had high standards and wouldn't settle for just anything. She bragged about wanting to get into event planning or interior design, even though she had no relevant experience. Travis, apparently smitten, was covering the rent, the bills, and everything else. Meanwhile, Lauren made the place look impressive for social media. She posted about their power couple status. She bragged about how supportive Travis was, how he never complained about finances, how they were building an empire together. All of it made me roll my eyes. I knew she was living in a fantasy. In time, Travis started getting suspicious about how quickly their expenses ballooned, especially as Lauren added more and more necessities to their lifestyle. I learned this from a mutual friend who happened to know Travis's coworker. Word got around that Travis was complaining about not being able to keep up with the bills. The friend said Travis mentioned he was pulling double shifts, but it still wasn't enough. Lauren refused to downsize her ambitions and kept pushing for more outings, more shopping, more everything. Travis was at his breaking point, apparently. I decided to give that last push. I had enough of Lauren's debt notices lying around my place to do some real damage. I gathered a stack of them, mostly unopened, but with visible return addresses from credit card companies and loan services. I wrote a brief note that said, "You left these behind, thought you might need them." Then I mailed everything directly to Travis at their new address. I included no return address, but I knew Travis would see exactly how many creditors were after Lauren. I pictured him opening that envelope, rummaging through letters demanding payments, seeing how deep Lauren was in. And I wanted him to realize she wasn't some innocent victim of circumstance. Sure enough, about a week after that, my mom told me she heard from Lauren. Apparently, there was a big fight with Travis about finances. She didn't go into detail, just said Lauren was frantic and complaining that she'd been ambushed by a bunch of overdue bills. My mom tried to stay neutral, but she let it slip that Travis was furious, threatening to break off the engagement if Lauren didn't start pulling her weight. My mom asked if I had any idea who might have sent those letters. I feigned ignorance, saying I had no clue. Maybe the companies tracked her down themselves. My mom seemed skeptical, but she didn't push it. Lauren was in full panic mode. She suddenly needed a job, any job, just to keep Travis from kicking her out. She called our mom, sobbing, saying that Travis was making her sign up for random retail positions, or else he'd leave. She still refused to reach out to me. She posted on social media about how people were out to get her, how some toxic family members couldn't stand to see her happy. I caught screenshots through mutual contacts. People who didn't know the full story were leaving supportive comments, telling her she deserved better. I just shook my head. A few weeks later, I heard through Karen that the landlord for Lauren and Travis's building was cracking down on late rent payments. Apparently, Travis had been behind once or twice. The landlord was quick to issue stern warnings. I also heard that Travis's store was cutting hours. He wasn't exactly the rock of stability Lauren had hoped for. They were behind on bills, behind on credit card payments, and behind on rent. Lauren's wedding fund was non-existent. She had no savings. Their fancy life was falling apart from the inside out. Still, she kept posting pretty pictures on social media, trying to maintain appearances. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. Then, out of nowhere, Travis contacted me on social media. He must have unblocked me from Lauren's account or found my info somewhere else. He sent a single message. "We need to talk." I had zero intention of giving him any explanations or insights into Lauren's behavior. If he wanted information, he could ask Lauren. Still, I was curious enough to respond. I kept it brief, telling him if Lauren had something to say, she could reach out herself. He said Lauren refused to. I said that wasn't my problem. He demanded to know if I had been the one to forward her debts to him. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He said something nasty, calling me vengeful and petty, claiming I was trying to sabotage their relationship. I asked him how it felt to be used, then blocked him. I felt a twinge of guilt for a moment, but it passed quickly. Lauren deserved this reality check. She could have parted ways amicably, or at least not dragged my name through the mud. Instead, she tried to paint me as the villain and pretend I never existed. Well, now she was dealing with the consequences of her own actions. I won't lie, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction seeing her carefully curated life unravel. About a month later, I got word from our cousin that Travis finally snapped and ended the engagement. He moved out of the pricey apartment, leaving Lauren stuck with a lease she couldn't afford. The landlord threatened to take legal action for breaking the lease, and Lauren was in total meltdown mode. She was behind on multiple payments, had a minimum wage retail job, and had no idea how to handle the avalanche of bills. She ended up breaking the lease as well, leaving her credit in shambles. I heard she tried staying with a friend, but the friend only had room for a few nights. Our parents, being the soft-hearted people they are, almost let her move back in with them. But by then, they'd finally seen evidence of how she'd lied about me, because Travis aired all her dirty laundry to anyone who would listen. He told them how she'd bragged about mooching off me, how she never intended to pay me back for anything, how she only said I was unsupportive after I asked her if she really loved him or just needed a meal ticket. He told them about the suspicious debts, about how she kept her financial mess hidden until it blew up in his face. My parents, hurt and betrayed, decided it was better if she found her own way. They offered to help her get a cheap place, but she refused, calling them ungrateful and saying they should support their daughter without conditions. They held firm, tired of being manipulated. Meanwhile, I carried on with my life. I kept going to work, enjoyed my condo in peace, and occasionally got updates from relatives who felt sorry for Lauren. She ended up sleeping on a friend's couch, then bouncing between other acquaintances for a while. She kept job hopping, never lasting long. She sold the engagement ring Travis had given her, but it wasn't worth much. She posted frantic, angry rants on social media about betrayal and how no one was there for her, claiming she'd been abandoned. Some people took pity on her, but most eventually saw through her act. Time passed, and I continued living comfortably with less drama. Every once in a while, I'd see her name pop up in conversation, but I never sought her out. She never tried to apologize, never tried to patch things up with me, or even clarify her lies. She just moved on, drifting further away from everyone who'd once cared about her. And I let her go. If she was waiting for me to come running back, begging for a relationship, she was going to wait forever. Some might say I should have forgiven her eventually, that I should have tried to rebuild the sibling bond. But why? She blocked me, lied about me, and used me. Then, when she got engaged, she erased me from her life. When that engagement fell through, she still didn't admit any wrongdoing. She has never shown genuine remorse. Sometimes forgiveness is just an invitation to be harmed all over again. I chose not to invite that chaos back into my life. I won't pretend I'm proud of everything I did. Part of me wonders if I should have just let karma take its course. But Lauren had been riding my kindness for so long, I felt she needed a direct lesson in consequences. Maybe if she had approached me at some point with sincerity, I would have considered a more peaceful resolution. Instead, she doubled down on her lies and tried to paint me as the villain. In a sense, she wrote the script for her own downfall. I just made sure the lines were delivered. At the end of it all, I have no regrets about sending her debts to Travis or tipping off the landlord. She left me no choice but to protect myself. If I had done nothing, she might have continued telling people I was an unsupportive sister who kicked her out. She might have convinced Travis to co-sign on more loans, burying him even deeper until he came after me for answers. This way, everything was out in the open. The truth was ugly, but it was the truth. Sometimes, family members ask if I do anything differently. I tell them I would have never let her move in without a timeline or a formal agreement. I should have asked for partial rent or at least made her sign something stating expectations. I should have listened to my gut when I saw her laziness and lack of respect for my home, but I can't change the past. I learned my lesson. If she ever tries to come back and live with me again, I'll have ironclad rules or I won't let her in at all. I still keep tabs on her occasionally, mostly through other relatives. Last I heard, she was working an office job that barely pays above minimum wage, living in a roommate situation with people she barely knows. She doesn't post many pictures online anymore, probably because she has nothing lavish to show off. She likes to tell her friends that she's just saving up for something better, that she's this close to starting her own business or moving somewhere more glamorous. It's the same old story. I don't hold my breath for any real change. As for Travis, I have no idea where he ended up. Probably somewhere less expensive, hopefully learning that a few months of infatuation isn't a solid foundation for marriage. I don't feel sorry for him. He proposed to someone he barely knew. He didn't question her lack of income, her dependency on others, or her financial sketchiness. He jumped in head first and only panicked when the water got too deep. I assume he'll be more cautious next time. I, on the other hand, have discovered peace in boundaries. Lauren taught me that you can't always save someone from themselves, no matter how much you love them. And if someone betrays you, you don't have to let them do it again. Sometimes, the only solution is to end their influence in your life. If they try to come back to haunt you or turn others against you, you stand your ground and make sure they face the repercussions of their actions. When I look back at those months I spent cooking her meals, cleaning up after her, and paying all the bills, I have flashes of resentment. But I also see how much I've grown because of it. I'm not a pushover anymore. If anyone tries to take advantage of me now, I shut it down quickly, and I owe that newfound strength to Lauren. She was the test I had to fail in order to learn. The betrayal was deep, but so was the lesson. Some might question whether revenge was really worth it. My answer is that it brought me closure. My intention wasn't to destroy her life forever. It was to ensure she couldn't skip off without consequences after maligning me. If she hadn't blocked me, lied about me, and painted me as a monster, I probably would have let her go with just a severed relationship. But she had to make me the scapegoat, and she had to do it publicly. That left me with one option: make sure she felt the weight of her own decisions. Family dynamics are complicated. People who haven't been used or lied about by a sibling don't always understand. They'll say, "But she's your sister," as though that erases the damage. Blood alone doesn't justify exposing yourself to a never-ending cycle of disrespect. When trust is broken so profoundly, it's naive to keep throwing yourself in front of the same speeding train. At some point, you have to walk away, or clear the tracks. By the time Lauren's engagement collapsed, and she was forced to break the lease, I realized she had no real support system left. She'd burned too many bridges, not just with me, but with friends she lied to or took advantage of. The only ones who stuck around were acquaintances who didn't know her patterns yet. Eventually, she'd show her true colors to them too. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered how coldly she blocked me, how she denied everything I did for her, how she slandered me. I reminded myself that pity isn't the same as forgiveness. I'm allowed to feel bad for her sad situation without letting her back into my life or absolving her of blame. People on the outside might say I went too far, but they don't know the history. They don't know the years I spent picking up her messes. They don't know how many times I bailed her out of trouble. They don't know the countless nights I worried about her well-being. They don't know how devastated I was when she kicked me aside like a used napkin. When your kindness is met with betrayal, you start to see the world differently. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's a necessary step to prevent repeat scenarios. In the end, I'm fine. I have my home to myself again. I pay my mortgage and my bills without anyone mooching off me. My stress level has dropped significantly. I have a solid circle of friends who value me for who I am. My relationship with my parents improved once they saw the truth, though they still worry about Lauren. They ask if I've heard from her, but I haven't. She stays in her corner of the world, presumably waiting for the next person to rescue her. At least now, nobody can say I didn't try. If she ever comes looking for me, begging for help, I'll remind her of how she treated me. She won't get an apology, and she certainly won't get a roof over her head for free. That door is closed. If that means we never speak again, so be it. I'm done playing the fool. I don't hate her, but I won't pretend she didn't bring this on herself. If that makes me heartless, then maybe being heartless is what it takes to keep from being trampled by people who only know how to consume and discard. That's where things stand. My life is better without her lies, her laziness, and her manipulations. Revenge might sound drastic, but in my case, it was the necessary catalyst for releasing the anger she caused. I made sure she faced the consequences of her actions, and I slept better at night knowing I wasn't letting her rewrite history to make me the villain in my own story. She wanted a new life on her own terms, ignoring the debts and the damage. Now she gets to deal with all of it head on. I'm content with that outcome. I don't expect a happy family reunion anytime soon. Lauren can spin whatever story she wants among people who still believe her. But if anyone approaches me, I have the facts ready. I have the receipts, literally and figuratively, to show what really happened. And at the end of the day, those who matter know the truth. I did my part by offering her a home, caring for her, and giving her every chance to do right by me. She made her choices. Now she's living with the aftermath, and I'm free. That's good enough for me. Used my first big paycheck to surprise my parents with a luxury resort getaway, but they called me the black sheep of the family. So I took a friend. Instead, I never imagined that the day I received my first big paycheck would turn my life upside down. I had spent years working overtime at a job I never dreamed I'd have, all with the goal of proving myself to the people who had always doubted me, my parents. Every extra shift, every sacrifice I made was aimed at earning their approval and finally proving that I wasn't the disappointment they always claimed I was. The paycheck was fat, and I was determined to use it in the one way I thought would show them how much I had grown, by surprising them with a luxury resort getaway. I envisioned their faces lighting up with pride and love, the kind of smiles I had craved since childhood. I even spent weeks researching the perfect resort, a place that promised a refined escape filled with comfort and indulgence, and I planned every detail meticulously. I remember the night before the big reveal. I sat alone in my tiny apartment, the only light coming from my laptop screen, as I double-checked every reservation detail. My heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. This wasn't just about the money, it was about proving that I was worthy, that I had finally stepped out of the shadow of being the so-called black sheep. I replayed memories of countless family dinners where my efforts had been met with sneers and disappointment. The sting of those moments had fueled my determination, and tonight, as I confirmed the final payment, I felt an intense mixture of hope and defiance. I was no longer going to let their opinions define me. The day of the surprise arrived with all the pomp and circumstance I could muster. I had arranged for everything: a pickup service from their home, a handwritten itinerary, even a bouquet of flowers delivered to the doorstep before I arrived. When I finally stepped into their living room, I was bursting with excitement, expecting hugs and tears of joy. Instead, I was met with cold stares and a barrage of comments that I still hear echoing in my mind. My parents barely concealed their disdain as they looked over the details I had so carefully prepared. My father's voice was particularly cutting as he said, "I guess even a black sheep can scrape together a little money for himself, but don't think you can buy your way into our hearts." Their words crashed over me like icy water, and in that moment, the surprise I had planned turned bitter. All the hope I had nurtured evaporated as their disappointment stung far more deeply than any financial setback ever could. For days after that encounter, I wandered in a fog of disbelief and humiliation. The luxurious getaway meant for them had become a painful reminder of my failure in their eyes. I'd imagined that money would open a door, but instead it reinforced every negative label they had ever attached to me. I couldn't understand how, after everything I had worked for, they could be so ungrateful and call me the very thing I had hoped to outgrow. The betrayal wasn't just in the words. They never even looked at me with any hint of pride. Their indifference was the final nail in the coffin of the hope I had clung to. I began to question every decision I had ever made, wondering if all the sacrifices had been for nothing. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew from family gatherings and retreated into myself. Every call, every message from them felt like a reminder of my inadequacy. I started keeping a journal, scribbling down every insult and dismissive remark they had thrown my way, as if recording these moments could somehow give them less power over me. I was angry, hurt, and determined that I would never allow myself to be so humiliated again. I began to plot, not against them in any grand, overt way, but a quiet, calculated revenge that would ensure they understood the true cost of their betrayal. It was during this low period that my best friend Marcus stepped in. He was the one person who had always believed in me, offering support when no one else would. Marcus had a way of grounding my turbulent emotions, reminding me that my worth wasn't tied to my parents' approval. Over countless late-night conversations, he urged me to let go of the need for validation from those who had never cared. And yet, as much as I wanted to embrace his words, I was consumed by the burning desire to make them see how wrong they were. In my heart, I was already plotting a way to make them feel the sting of rejection that they had inflicted upon me. After several sleepless nights, I devised a plan. I decided to cancel the resort reservation, a decision that initially felt like surrender, but was in reality the first step toward reclaiming my self-respect. I informed the resort that the booking was no longer needed, a move that saved me a substantial amount of money. I told Marcus about my decision, and he encouraged me to use the funds to do something truly meaningful, something that would allow me to embrace life on my own terms rather than waiting for a pat on the back from people who had never truly supported me. "Don't let them dictate your future," he said firmly, and his words resonated deep within me. I began investing in experiences and ventures that I had always dreamed of but had never dared to pursue. I enrolled in photography classes, started a small business selling my artwork online, and even planned a solo trip across the country. With each new venture, I felt a sense of liberation. The money that I had once envisioned as a ticket to familial approval was now fueling my own personal renaissance. I was finally starting to see the value in forging my own path, rather than bending over backward for the acceptance of people who could never appreciate me. But deep down, the desire for retribution still smoldered. I couldn't let go of the memory of their callous words so easily. So I hatched another part of my plan, one that involved Marcus's help. Together, we decided to throw a lavish party, one that would be the envy of everyone in our social circle, including my parents. I invited all my friends, acquaintances, and even some former family friends who had always seen the truth about my worth. I made sure to spread the word far and wide through social media, letting everyone know that this party was a celebration of freedom, self-worth, and the courage to defy those who try to keep you down. The night of the party arrived, and it was a resounding success. The venue was decorated to perfection, with twinkling lights and elegant details that reflected the hard-won success of reinventing my life. Guests arrived in droves, each one contributing to the charged atmosphere of triumph and liberation. I remember standing in the middle of the room, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction as I watched people laugh, dance, and celebrate. Marcus clapped me on the back and said, "This is your night, man. Let them see what happens when you stop playing by their rules." And as I looked around at all the vibrant faces, I realized that I was finally living on my own terms. At one point during the party, I received a text from my mother. The message was curt, something along the lines of, "We don't want anything to do with you." It was a moment that might have shattered me, but instead, it galvanized my resolve. I decided not to respond. I knew that giving them the satisfaction of seeing my hurt would only feed their cruelty. Instead, I continued to celebrate, my laughter louder and my smile brighter with every passing moment. The party became not just a celebration of my newfound independence, but a declaration that I would no longer be defined by the narrow perceptions of others. In the weeks that followed the party, I began to see the ripple effects of that fateful night. Friends who had once been distant now reached out with genuine admiration, congratulating me on my courage and celebrating my accomplishments. I received offers for collaborations on projects I had only dreamed of, and slowly, the emptiness that had once consumed me was replaced with a burgeoning sense of purpose. Marcus was right. I was finally in control of my destiny. Every new day felt like a chance to build something better, to create a future that wasn't shadowed by the ghosts of my past. I began to document my journey online, sharing my experiences on various forums and communities. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out with their own stories of overcoming rejection, and in that exchange of raw emotions and triumphs, I found a kinship that transcended blood ties. Yet, there was still one piece of the puzzle I couldn't ignore. The thought of my parents' cold dismissal haunted me, and I knew that if I truly wanted to break free, I had to confront that betrayal head-on. I arranged a meeting with them under the pretense of wanting to reconcile, even though I wasn't prepared to forgive. I wanted them to see the stark contrast between the life they had tried to condemn and the vibrant, successful person I had become. The meeting took place at a neutral venue, a small, upscale cafe where the ambiance was quiet and intimate. I arrived early, rehearsing my words in my head, determined to express everything I had held back for so long. When they finally arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. My father was the first to speak, his tone heavy with a mix of regret and defensiveness. "We never meant to hurt you," he began, but his words rang hollow. I interrupted him with a steady voice. "I don't need your apologies. I'm not here to mend bridges that you burned long ago." My mother's eyes welled up, but she quickly wiped away her tears as I continued. "I worked my entire life to earn this paycheck, to buy you a getaway that I thought would bring us together. Instead, you dismissed me as the black sheep. I don't need your pity or your validation." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I've built a life that I'm proud of, with people who respect me, people like Marcus and my friends. I'm done trying to gain your approval. From now on, I choose myself." They tried to argue, to soften their stance with promises of change, but I wasn't interested. I left that meeting feeling lighter than I had in years. I realized that forgiveness was not for them, it was for me. Forgiving would have meant accepting their behavior as acceptable, and I could not allow that. I had tasted the sweet satisfaction of independence and success, and I wasn't about to give it up for anyone who had only ever tried to diminish me. The revenge was not in any grand, destructive act. It was in the reclamation of my life, the rejection of their attempts to define me, and the celebration of every small victory along the way. In the years that followed, I continued to thrive. I expanded my business, traveled to places I'd once only dreamed of, and even began mentoring others who felt trapped by the judgment of their families. Every success, every accolade was a quiet rebuke to the voices of my past that had told me I was worthless. I still occasionally heard my parents' comments in family gatherings and on distant phone calls, but they no longer had any power over me. Their attempts to label me as the black sheep were just that, labels that held no truth in the light of the life I had forged for myself. Marcus and I often reminisced about that turbulent period, but even in our memories, the focus wasn't on bitterness, it was on liberation. He once said, "You turned your pain into power. You refused to be defined by their narrow vision, and that's what true strength is all about." His words echoed in my mind every time I faced a challenge. I learned to channel that anger into creative energy, turning every setback into an opportunity for growth. The financial stability that had once been the goal of that grand gesture became the stepping stone to a series of adventures and projects that enriched my life far beyond what I had ever imagined. There were moments when I almost felt a pang of nostalgia for the family ties I once hoped to mend, but those moments were fleeting. I recognized that sometimes the best revenge is living well, thriving in spite of those who wished to see you fail. I became an example to others who struggled with familial rejection, a living testament that one could rise above even the most painful betrayals. My story wasn't one of bitterness or endless vendettas. It was a story of transformation. I transformed my pain into a driving force that propelled me into a future full of promise and possibility. Looking back, I realized that the shock of that fateful day, when my parents' harsh words shattered my illusions, was the catalyst for everything that came after. It forced me to confront the truth about who I was and who I wanted to become. I learned that sometimes the most profound acts of rebellion are not found in dramatic gestures of destruction, but in the quiet, steady reclamation of one's own life. The luxurious getaway that I had once planned as a gift for my parents became a symbol of all I had lost and, ultimately, all I had gained. I may have lost their respect, but in return, I discovered a strength and resilience that I never knew existed within me. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who has not only survived betrayal, but has thrived in its aftermath. I no longer seek validation from those who have no right to it. Instead, I fill my life with genuine relationships and pursue passions that set my soul on fire. I'm no longer the black sheep. They may always see me that way, but I wear that label like a badge of honor, a reminder of the obstacles I've overcome and the price I paid for authenticity. The memory of that bitter surprise has become the cornerstone of my success. A turning point that taught me to stand alone if necessary and to value my own worth above all else. I share my story not to boast or to incite envy, but to let anyone who has ever felt betrayed know that there is a path forward. Sometimes the ones who hurt us most are the ones whose opinions we must learn to disregard. I took the money that I had once intended to mend broken ties and used it instead to build a life filled with adventure, creativity, and genuine love from friends who truly appreciated me. In the end, the sweetest revenge wasn't about making my parents suffer. It was about liberating myself from the chains of their expectations. I replaced their empty praise with a community that valued authenticity and kindness, and that made all the difference. So, to anyone who has ever been cast aside, who has ever been told they were unworthy, remember this: your value isn't determined by someone else's inability to see it. Sometimes, the most empowering act is to walk away and create a life where you are celebrated. I did just that, and I'll never look back. The pain of their betrayal has faded into the background, replaced by the vibrant, unstoppable force of my own potential. I'm no longer waiting for approval. I'm busy living, growing, and thriving on my own terms. And that, in the end, is the most satisfying revenge of all. Every time I hear my parents mention me in passing, there's a cold distance in their tone, but I no longer feel that sting. Instead, I feel a quiet satisfaction knowing that I built a world where my worth is recognized by those who matter. I've learned that sometimes the only way to truly win is to walk away from a losing battle. I forgave nothing and expected nothing from them, and in that void, I discovered a universe of possibility. With every new opportunity, every challenge met head-on, I am reminded that my journey is mine alone, a narrative of resilience, determination, and unwavering self-belief. As I sit here now, recounting these events with a calm heart and a steady mind, I can't help but smile at how far I've come. The sting of betrayal has dulled, replaced by a quiet strength and a deep sense of pride. I turned my first big paycheck into more than just a financial milestone. I turned it into the turning point of my life. And while my parents may always see me as the black sheep, I wear that label proudly. It reminds me that I have overcome, that I have thrived in spite of their disapproval, and that I have built a life rich with meaning and passion. I share my experience here on this forum not as a tale of revenge for revenge's sake, but as a declaration of independence. I want anyone reading this to know that their worth is not defined by the opinions of those who refuse to understand them. I turned a painful betrayal into the catalyst for a personal revolution. I embraced the support of a true friend and the encouragement of a community that celebrated authenticity. And most importantly, I learned that the sweetest revenge is not in inflicting pain, but in rising above it and living the life you always deserved. Now, as I look toward the future, I see endless possibilities. I continue to nurture my passions, expand my horizons, and remain unyielding in the face of adversity. I am no longer waiting for validation from those who failed to recognize my worth. Instead, I build every day on the foundation of self-respect and hard-earned success. I carry with me the lessons of my past. Each insult, each act of betrayal transformed into fuel for my relentless pursuit of a better, brighter future. In the end, I learned that true freedom comes not from the approval of others, but from embracing your own identity. I used that first big paycheck to mark the end of an era, a time when I was defined by my parents' narrow expectations. Today, I stand tall, a living testament to the power of self-determination and the beauty of crafting your own destiny. And if that means leaving behind a family that never truly cared, then so be it. I chose a friend over empty promises, and in doing so, I found the love and respect I had been searching for all along. I hope my story inspires you to take control of your narrative, to refuse to let anyone else dictate your worth. Remember, the only validation that truly matters comes from within. I am proud of who I have become, and I know that every setback was a stepping stone toward a future filled with promise. I chose to rise above the betrayal and create a life that is rich in love, opportunity, and genuine connection, and that is the ultimate triumph. I never imagined that a family feud could spiral into a nightmare that would upend my entire world. Yet, here I am, recounting every twist and turn of a story that begins with a seemingly small, personal decision and escalates into a bitter legal battle fueled by betrayal and a thirst for revenge. I always knew life had a way of twisting things into shapes we never expected, but I never expected that my sister-in-law, Mara, would be capable of stooping so low as to tamper with my pregnancy medication. All because I refused to name my baby after her ex-husband Jason, the man she infamously cheated on with his own brother. I remember the first time I noticed something was off. I was in the middle of my second trimester, feeling the usual mix of joy and anxiety that accompanies pregnancy. My body was changing, and I was adapting to this new life inside me. One afternoon, after a routine visit to my doctor, I started experiencing odd side effects. My heart raced uncontrollably, and I felt dizzy and nauseous far more than I should have been. Initially, I chalked it up to the natural stresses of pregnancy, but soon, the symptoms intensified to the point where even the simplest tasks became a challenge. At first, I didn't suspect foul play. I trusted my family implicitly, until I learned the truth. It turned out that Mara had been meddling with my medication. I discovered this when I confronted a pharmacist who mentioned that my prescription had been altered, the dosage inexplicably reduced. The pharmacist's puzzled look had done little to ease my concerns, and a sense of dread began to gnaw at me. How could someone I considered family be responsible for risking the life of my unborn child? I took a deep breath and began piecing together the clues. Mara had always been envious, not just of the attention I received as a pregnant woman, but of my steadfast refusal to succumb to her bizarre demands. She had once insisted, almost as a command, that I name my baby after Jason, her former lover. The idea was ludicrous to me. I wanted my child to have a name that held meaning for us, not a constant reminder of her manipulations and her sordid history. And yet, Mara couldn't accept my decision. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the fact that I dared to assert my own identity and priorities. I recall the moment of realization vividly. I had found a cryptic note in the medicine cabinet, a note that read like a taunt. It hinted at secrets and betrayals, referencing a past I'd hoped to leave behind. I soon discovered that Mara, driven by bitterness over her failed relationships and the scandal that had rocked our family, had resorted to extreme measures. In her twisted mind, ensuring that I experienced suffering was a way to settle scores. And so, with calculated malice, she had tampered with my medication. The betrayal cut deep. I had trusted Mara implicitly, considering her a close relative who should have had my best interests at heart. Instead, she had exploited that trust to jeopardize both my health and that of my baby. I felt both violated and enraged. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If she wanted to hurt me, she wouldn't stop until I was completely broken. But I was not a victim to be cowed. I was a mother-to-be, and I would fight tooth and nail for my child. My first impulse was to confront her. I remember the cold, bitter anger as I stood in her kitchen, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. I demanded an explanation, my voice trembling between fury and disbelief. She offered vague denials, feigning shock and concern, but I could see the smug satisfaction in the way she looked at me, a look that told me she knew exactly what she'd done and relished every moment of my suffering. That was the moment I knew there would be no forgiveness. Not for her, not for any betrayal. After that confrontation, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I was going to take legal action. I couldn't let her get away with endangering my life and the life of my baby. I began gathering every scrap of evidence I could, medical records, pharmacy receipts, and even surveillance footage from my doctor's office. I documented every symptom, every unexplained event, meticulously crafting a timeline that would expose her treachery. I was determined that the legal system would hold her accountable and that justice would be served. The legal process was grueling. Court dates, endless paperwork, and the pressure of having my personal life scrutinized in a very public forum took its toll. I spent sleepless nights poring over documents, speaking with my lawyer, and planning every detail of our case. The courtroom became my battleground, and every testimony was a weapon in my arsenal. It wasn't just about the law, it was about reclaiming my dignity and protecting the life growing inside me. Throughout the trial, I was forced to relive the betrayal over and over. Every question in court brought up painful memories of that fateful day and the numerous times I doubted my own sanity. But with each retelling, my resolve hardened. I was no longer the frightened, vulnerable woman who had once trusted Mara implicitly. I had become a warrior, determined to expose her deceit and ensure that no one else would suffer at her hands. I made sure to detail every single piece of evidence, leaving no stone unturned in my pursuit of justice. The courtroom drama reached a fever pitch when Mara's own past came back to haunt her. Testimonies from relatives and friends painted a picture of a woman consumed by bitterness and jealousy, a woman who had allowed personal vendettas to cloud her judgment. It was revealed that Mara had a history of using manipulation to control those around her, and her latest act was just the most egregious example. With each revelation, the jury's eyes grew wider, and the weight of her crimes became impossible to ignore. I remember sitting in the courtroom as the verdict was read. Every minute felt like an eternity, and when the final word of the sentence was spoken, I felt a surge of vindication so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. Mara was held accountable for her actions, ordered to pay damages not just for the physical harm she'd inflicted upon me, but also for the emotional torment I had endured. The verdict was not just a legal victory, it was a personal triumph over betrayal and cruelty. I had taken back control of my life, and in doing so, I sent a clear message. Those who betray trust will not go unpunished. But the story doesn't end with the courtroom. Even as the legal battle drew to a close, I knew that my fight was far from over. The emotional scars would remain, a constant reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. In the weeks that followed, I devoted myself to healing and rebuilding my life. I took extra precautions with my health, ensuring that every aspect of my pregnancy was monitored closely. I surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared, distancing myself from those who would try to exploit my vulnerability again. Yet, every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the reflection of a woman who had been shattered by betrayal, but who had managed to piece herself back together with unyielding strength. I was no longer defined by the actions of someone else. Instead, I was defined by my resilience, my determination, and my unwavering commitment to protect my child. I knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but I was ready to face it head on. Revenge, in my eyes, wasn't about sinking to the level of the betrayer. It was about reclaiming power. I refused to allow Mara's actions to dictate the course of my life. Instead, I channeled my energy into ensuring that justice was served and that my child would grow up in a world where betrayal and manipulation were not tolerated. I became an advocate for stricter regulations on pharmaceutical practices and even worked with support groups to help other victims of similar abuse. My journey, painful as it was, transformed me into someone who could stand up for others, someone who had turned personal tragedy into a force for good. Looking back, I realized that the betrayal by my own family could have easily left me broken beyond repair. But I chose a different path, a path of calculated revenge that was rooted in justice rather than blind fury. I never forgave Mara. Forgiveness, in this case, would have meant accepting her actions as a minor misstep. Instead, I held her accountable, ensuring that every person who had ever doubted me would see that I was not a victim, but a survivor. I took legal action not for the sake of vengeance alone, but to send a message. Trust is sacred, and once broken, it must be rebuilt through accountability and truth. Every day since that verdict has been a reminder of the strength it takes to fight back against betrayal. I now understand that the scars of that time will always be with me, but they are also a testament to my resilience. I have learned that in a world filled with deceit, the only way to protect yourself is to stand firm, to fight for what is right, and to never let anyone dictate the course of your life. My battle was not just a personal vendetta, it was a declaration of independence from those who would try to control my destiny. Even now, as I prepare to welcome my child into a safer, more secure world, I am filled with a sense of empowerment. The legal system may have handed down a verdict, but the real victory was in the journey itself. I reclaimed my voice, my power, and my future. And while Mara's actions will forever be a stain on our family history, they have also given me the strength to become a force for change. I refuse to be defined by her betrayal. Instead, I choose to define myself by my actions, my convictions, and my unwavering commitment to protect those I love. This is not a story of forgiveness. It is a story of survival, of standing up when life pushes you to your limits, and of taking the necessary steps to ensure that justice prevails. I took legal action because I had no other choice, because allowing betrayal to go unpunished would have meant compromising everything I stand for. And so, I fought. I fought with every ounce of strength I possessed, not just for myself, but for my child and for every person who has ever been wronged by someone they trusted. In the end, justice was served, and while the scars remain, they are a constant reminder that I have the power to shape my destiny. I will never forgive Mara for what she did, and I will continue to fight for a world where betrayal does not go unanswered. This is my story, a story of pain, resilience, and a deeply personal revenge that was as satisfying as it was necessary. I hope that my journey can serve as a beacon for those who find themselves caught in the web of deceit, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we can find the strength to rise again and reclaim our lives. Now, as I stand on the precipice of a new beginning, I know that I am stronger than any betrayal. I have learned that the power to change the narrative lies within us, and that by holding those who wrong us accountable, we pave the way for a future built on trust and respect. My journey has been long and arduous, but every step has led me to this moment, a moment of triumph over those who would use deceit as a weapon. I look forward to the day when my child can grow up free from the shadows of betrayal, in a world where every act of treachery is met with unwavering justice. I share my story not to incite anger, but to remind anyone facing similar trials that you have the strength to fight back. When betrayal strikes, let it fuel your determination to stand up for yourself. I will never forget the lessons I learned in that dark time, and I will always be vigilant against those who seek to undermine what is sacred. I took legal action not merely as an act of revenge, but as a declaration that my body, my choices, and my future are mine to control. In the end, justice prevailed, and that is something that no one can ever take away from me. Today, as I cradle the promise of a new life in my arms, I know that every tear shed, every moment of doubt, and every beat of my racing heart was worth it. I emerged from that battle to not broken, but reborn, a warrior armed with the resolve to protect what is most precious. And while Mara's betrayal will forever cast a long shadow over my past, it has also illuminated the path to a future where I stand tall, unyielding, and resolute in my quest for justice. This is my truth, a raw, unfiltered account of betrayal and retribution that has reshaped my destiny. I will continue to live my life with the knowledge that my actions speak louder than any whispered secret, that my determination to fight for what is right is an inheritance I pass on to my child. I am no longer the timid soul who once believed in unconditional trust. I am a survivor, a fighter, and above all, a mother determined to ensure that my child's future is one of strength, honor, and unassailable justice. In sharing this story, I hope that those who have experienced betrayal find solace in knowing that revenge, when pursued with unwavering determination, can be as satisfying as it is just. I took the painful road of legal action because I refused to let someone else dictate the terms of my life. Instead, I took control, and in doing so, I reclaimed everything that was rightfully mine. This is my story, a testament to the power of resilience and a stark reminder that some betrayals are too deep to ever be forgiven. As I look back on everything that transpired, I feel an immense sense of pride for having stood up for myself when it would have been so much easier to crumble under the weight of deceit. Every obstacle, every sleepless night spent poring over legal documents, every tear shed in the solitude of my thoughts, it all culminated in a victory that was as personal as it was profound. I will carry the scars of that period with me forever, not as symbols of weakness, but as badges of honor that mark the triumph of my spirit over treachery. There is no sweetness in forgiveness when the betrayal is as profound as Mara's. I chose to let justice be the measure of my strength, and I will continue to let it guide me in every decision I make. This is not the end of my journey, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where I forge ahead with the knowledge that, Despite the darkness of the past, the future remains bright with promise and potential. I will always remember the lesson that betrayal is best answered with an unwavering commitment to truth, a fierce determination to protect what is precious, and a refusal to ever let anyone else control my fate. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the memories of that painful chapter threaten to overwhelm me, I remind myself that every struggle, every moment of despair, was a stepping stone towards a life that is truly my own. I have emerged stronger, wiser, and infinitely more determined to ensure that no one will ever again use my vulnerabilities against me. I am a testament to the fact that even in the midst of betrayal, there lies a spark of indomitable will, a spark that, when nurtured, can ignite a flame of justice so powerful that it leaves even the most calculated manipulator in ruins. This is the legacy I choose to leave behind, a legacy of strength, of relentless pursuit of justice, and of a mother's unwavering love for her child. My story is etched in every scar, every legal victory, every moment of defiance against those who would dare to betray the sanctity of family. I will not forgive Mara, nor will I ever forget the lessons learned in the crucible of her treachery. Instead, I choose to honor my journey by living every day with the fierce knowledge that I am in control of my destiny, and that no act of betrayal will ever again have the power to break me. Standing at the threshold of a new beginning, I embrace the future with open arms and an unyielding heart. I share my story to remind you that in the face of betrayal, revenge need not be a blind, destructive force. It can be a measured, calculated assertion of your right to live free from the shadows of deceit. This is my truth, a truth carved out of pain and solidified by justice. I am the architect of my future, and I will continue to build a life that is defined not by the scars of the past, but by the promise of tomorrow. A tomorrow where every act of treachery is met with a steadfast resolve to protect what is dear, and where every betrayal is met with an unwavering commitment to reclaim what is rightfully ours. And so, as I prepare to welcome my child into a world that is finally free from the manipulations of a treacherous soul, I stand tall with the knowledge that every decision I made in the midst of despair was a declaration of my strength. I took legal action because I refused to let betrayal define me, and in doing so, I have transformed my life into a powerful testament of resilience and retribution. I will forever cherish the victory that justice bestowed upon me, and I will never forget that the only way to heal from betrayal is to rise, fight, and claim back the narrative of your life. This is the story of my battle against deception, my unwavering quest for justice, and the ultimate reclamation of my destiny. A story that I share in the hope that it might inspire others to stand firm in the face of betrayal and to fight relentlessly for what is rightfully theirs. I have left behind the shattered remnants of trust and embraced a future where every wrong is met with the full force of accountability. I will continue to honor my past by ensuring that the future I create is one where love, respect, and justice reign supreme. I share these words with you now, not to dwell on the pain of the past, but to celebrate the strength that was forged in the fire of betrayal. My journey is a reminder that even when the ones closest to us betray our trust, we have the power to rise, to fight, and to redefine the boundaries of what is acceptable. I took legal action when I was backed into a corner, and that action became the catalyst for a transformation that has made me unbreakable. Today, I stand here with a heart that has been scarred yet remains unyielding, a spirit that has been tested yet refuses to be broken. I chose not to forgive because forgiveness, in this case, would have meant accepting a betrayal that I could never live with. Instead, I channeled that pain into a drive for justice, a commitment to ensuring that those who dare to undermine the sanctity of family and trust face the consequences of their actions. Now, as I look forward to the future with cautious optimism and fierce determination, I carry with me the lessons of the past. A past that, though marred by betrayal, has ultimately led me to a place of strength and resilience. I am no longer defined by the actions of Mara or by the bitterness of what she tried to impose upon my life. I am defined by the choices I made in the face of adversity, by the courage I summoned when everything seemed lost, and by the relentless pursuit of a future where justice prevails over deceit. This is my story. It is raw, unfiltered, and entirely mine. A story of betrayal, revenge, and the unyielding power of a woman determined to protect her future. I share it now as a testament to the fact that while betrayal may wound us deeply, it can also serve as the catalyst for a transformation that empowers us to reclaim our lives, to seek justice, and to build a future where every act of treachery is met with the strength of our convictions. Every word of this story is a reminder that no matter how dark the past may be, the promise of a brighter, more just future is always within reach. I will never forgive Mara, because forgiveness in this instance would have meant surrendering the fight that has defined my journey. Instead, I stand here with the firm resolve that those who betray trust will always face the consequences of their actions, a truth that I will carry with me every day as I step boldly into the future. This is my truth, laid bare for all who are willing to listen. I took legal action because I believed in justice, because I refused to let someone else control the narrative of my life. And in doing so, I reclaimed not only my body and my future, but also the fundamental right to define my own destiny. I will never again allow betrayal to dictate my actions, and I will never forget the lesson that the path to true freedom is paved with the unwavering courage to stand up for oneself. As I close this chapter and begin anew, I am filled with an indescribable mix of relief, pride, and a steadfast commitment to ensuring that no one else will have to endure the suffering I once did. I have emerged from this ordeal not as a broken woman, but as someone who has forged an unbreakable spirit in the fires of betrayal. This is my story, and I share it with you in the hope that it will serve as a beacon of strength for anyone who finds themselves trapped in the clutches of deceit. I stand here today, forever changed but unbowed, ready to embrace the future with a heart that knows no compromise when it comes to justice, a spirit that will never falter in the face of betrayal, and a determination that will ensure that the legacy of my struggle lives on in the form of a brighter, more accountable tomorrow. There are moments when I revisit this chapter of my life, and though the memories are painful, they also remind me of the incredible strength I possess. I look back on the days of uncertainty and the relentless legal battles, not with regret, but with gratitude, for every hardship taught me that the price of betrayal is high, and that true justice is worth every sacrifice. I have become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And so, as I prepare to welcome a new life into this world, a life that will never know the cruelty of betrayal, I make a promise. I will continue to fight for a world where trust is sacred and where every act of treachery is met with swift and uncompromising justice. This is my legacy, my personal revolution against the forces of deceit, and a reminder that while the scars of betrayal may remain, they only serve to highlight the strength it takes to overcome them. I share my story in full, every painful detail and every victorious moment, with the hope that it inspires those who read these words to stand strong, to never compromise on what is right, and to always remember that justice, when pursued with unyielding determination, is the most satisfying revenge of all. I never imagined that the wedding I'd been planning for years would unravel into a nightmare. 2 months before my wedding, I walked into my bedroom expecting the usual quiet of a routine morning, and instead, I caught my fiancée, Elise, entwined in a passionate embrace with my own brother, David. In that frozen moment, my heart hammered against my ribs and my mind went blank. Every detail remains seared into my memory, the shock in my eyes, the whispered apologies that died in the thick silence, and the cold realization that the people I trusted most had betrayed me. I had given them both the keys to my heart, and in an instant, they shattered every piece of trust I'd ever built. Before that day, everything had seemed perfect. Elise and I had met in college, a chance encounter that quickly blossomed into what I thought was the kind of love that would last a lifetime. I was planning a modest wedding that promised to honor our bond, a celebration of two souls destined to be together. David and I had been inseparable since childhood, our bond forged over years of shared secrets, laughter, and even the occasional petty argument that only brothers can have. That is why the betrayal cut so deeply. It wasn't just an affair. It was the collision of two pillars in my life. The devastation was overwhelming, leaving me questioning not only my judgment, but the very nature of love and loyalty. In the days after the discovery, I cycled relentlessly between blinding anger and crushing despair. I confronted them in the dim light of our shared past, but their feeble apologies and hollow expressions of regret only deepened my pain. Elise's tearful mutterings of remorse and David's dismissive shrug both betrayed a cold indifference that made me feel smaller than I ever thought possible. That night, sleep eluded me as I sat alone in the dark, replaying the moment again and again in my head. Each replay was a brutal reminder of how quickly the life I'd envisioned was crumbling into dust. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't an option, not for what they'd done, and certainly not for the part of me that had been so ruthlessly deceived. As the initial shock faded, a steely resolve began to take root. I couldn't, and wouldn't, be the victim in this twisted narrative. I decided that if betrayal was their chosen currency, then revenge would be the only transaction I was willing to make. I spent endless hours poring over emails, text messages, and every scrap of evidence that could prove the depth of their deception. I meticulously documented every secret phone call and every unexplained absence, compiling a dossier that transformed raw hurt into cold, hard proof. With every piece of evidence I unearthed, the plan for my revenge grew clearer. I wasn't driven solely by a desire to hurt them back. I needed to reclaim my identity, to prove to myself and to the world that I was not defined by their treachery. The turning point came when I discovered a series of incriminating emails between Elise and David. Their correspondence wasn't a spur-of-the-moment dalliance. It was a calculated exchange that revealed months of planning, plotting, and betrayal. They discussed their illicit meetings with chilling detachment, even scheming about how to exploit my wedding day for their own selfish gain. Reading their words, I felt a cold fury rising inside me, a fury that would not be quenched by tears or empty apologies. I knew that to silence the echoes of betrayal, I had to expose their darkest secrets to the light of day. I began to map out every detail of my plan with the precision of a military strategist. I chose a trusted journalist known for uncovering corruption and scandal. Over weeks, I encrypted and anonymized every file until not a trace of my identity remained. I arranged for private investigators to shadow Elise's every move and to corroborate the timeline I had painstakingly assembled. Every step of the plan was designed to leave no room for escape or revisionism. The files, the recordings, the damning emails, all were weapons in my arsenal. I wasn't out for mere public shaming. I was out to dismantle the carefully constructed facade that Elise and David had maintained for so long. The day the article went live is etched in my memory with brutal clarity. I remember sitting in my car, parked at a safe distance, and watching as the headlines exploded across every local news outlet. The article detailed the scandal in stark, unflinching language, a narrative that left no doubt about the depth of their betrayal. As the story spread like wildfire, the public turned against them with a fury I hadn't anticipated. Elise's reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and David, once revered as a loyal brother, was reduced to a pariah overnight. The backlash was swift and merciless. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the disgrace that now defined their family. Yet the universe had one more cruel twist in store. In the aftermath of the scandal, Elise discovered she was pregnant with David's child. The irony was as bitter as it was inescapable. My own blood had conspired with the woman I loved to create a life that was now a living reminder of their betrayal. My parents, in their unwavering idealism, insisted that I support Elise for the sake of the innocent life growing inside her. They argued that a child was never at fault for the sins of its parents, and that family was a bond that could not be severed by mere betrayal. Their pleas, however, rang hollow in my ears. Supporting Elise meant condoning the very act that had shattered my life. I refused to be drawn into their delusional notion of familial duty when it came at the expense of my own dignity. I remember one bitter evening when, during a family dinner that felt more like an interrogation, my parents tried to convince me that Elise was still their daughter-in-law in spirit, deserving of love and support. Their voices were gentle, their eyes full of pity, but every word felt like a fresh wound. I told them plainly that my life was not theirs to repair, and that my loyalty was to the truth, not to an illusion of unity built on deceit. The conversation ended in silence, but the damage was done. I had drawn an unyielding line, a boundary that no amount of parental pressure could cross. I would not sacrifice myself to atone for the sins of those who had so carelessly dismantled my life. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew from everyone and everything that reminded me of what I had lost. I avoided social gatherings, distanced myself from mutual friends, and immersed myself in work and solitary walks that gave me time to reflect on the ruins of my former life. The solitude was both a curse and a blessing, a constant reminder of the betrayal, yet also the space I needed to forge a new path. With every step I took, the resolve in my heart only hardened. I would not let their treachery define me. Instead, I channeled that pain into a fire that burned away the remnants of my naivety, leaving behind a tempered determination that nothing would ever break me again. The night I finally pressed send on that encrypted email to the journalist was a turning point. I sat alone in my study, the only light coming from the glow of my computer screen, and with trembling fingers, I transmitted the files that would expose Elise and David for who they truly were. In that instant, I felt both an immense weight lift from my shoulders and a deeper, colder emptiness settle in. It was a moment of liberation, yet also the final severance of a bond that had once defined my life. I knew there was no turning back. The path I had chosen was irrevocable, and I would see it through, no matter the cost. The fallout was immediate and unforgiving. Within days, news of the scandal had consumed every corner of our small town. Public opinion was a raging inferno, and every whispered conversation, every condemning glance, reaffirmed that justice was being served. I watched from a distance as Elise's carefully constructed life disintegrated before my eyes. Former friends turned their backs, and even those who had once offered support now seemed to recoil from the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. David, unable to withstand the overwhelming tide of public outrage, disappeared from view, his absence as complete as if he had never existed. I later learned that he had fled, leaving behind a legacy of shame and regret that no one could clean up. In the midst of the chaos, I began to document every new development. I recorded phone conversations where Elise tried to defend her actions, noting how her voice would waver before turning cold and detached. I gathered statements from acquaintances who had observed her secret meetings and compiled a timeline that left no doubt about the premeditation of her affair. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of the facade they had so meticulously built. I wasn't driven by a desire to see them suffer for suffering's sake. I wanted the world to know the truth. I needed every shred of deception to be laid bare, so that no one would ever again mistake my pain for weakness. I even sought out a close friend, a person who had once been privy to the undercurrents of my life, to meet in a crowded, inconspicuous cafe. Over bitter cups of coffee, I recounted every detail, every moment that had led to my irrevocable decision to expose them. My friend's eyes widened in disbelief as I described the cold calculations hidden behind Elise's apologies and the indifferent shrug that had been David's only response. He warned me that the path I was on might lead to unforeseen consequences, that the pursuit of such unyielding justice might consume me from within. But even as his words echoed in my mind, I knew that compromise was not an option. I had reached a point where every ounce of betrayal demanded an equal measure of retribution. The day I saw the published article, I felt a grim satisfaction mixed with a hollow sorrow. I was standing in the parking lot of a local shopping center when I checked my phone, and there it was, headline after headline exposing the scandal in stark, unrelenting detail. The community's reaction was instantaneous and severe. People I had once trusted now whispered behind my back, and yet, strangers sent messages of support, congratulating me on my bravery. In that moment, I understood that by holding them accountable, I had not only reclaimed my narrative, but also ignited a spark of justice in the hearts of others who had been silenced by betrayal. The universe, however, was not done with its cruel twists. Soon after the article's release, Elise's secret became even more complicated when she discovered she was pregnant with David's child. The revelation sent shockwaves through our already fractured family. My parents, clinging desperately to the idea that blood was thicker than betrayal, insisted that I support her during this ordeal. They argued that a child was innocent, undeserving of the fallout from its parents' sins, and that my duty was to uphold family unity at all costs. Their pleas were not based on compassion, but on a misguided sense of loyalty that ignored the raw truth of my suffering. I told them, as plainly as I could, that I would never be a crutch for the consequences of their reckless choices. In the aftermath of the scandal, I tried to rebuild my life piece by piece. I immersed myself in work, rediscovering old passions and forging new paths that allowed me to channel the turbulent emotions swirling inside me. Art and writing became my refuge, a means of converting my agony into something tangible, a declaration that, despite the betrayal, I was still here, still fighting. My creative work began to draw attention from others who had suffered similar betrayals, and in that community of wounded souls, I found an unexpected solidarity. Every story shared, every empathetic nod, reinforced my belief that justice, though often painful, was the only way to reclaim one's identity after trust had been shattered. Yet, even as I found solace in my work, I was haunted by memories of that fateful day. In quiet moments, when the world around me had fallen silent, the faces of Elise and David would reappear in my mind, reminding me of the fragility of trust and the cruelty of betrayal. I refused to allow those memories to control me, though. I transformed them into a relentless drive for accountability. Every time a painful memory threatened to overwhelm me, I revisited the files, the recordings, the emails, each a testament to the cold truth that had set me free. One evening, as I sat alone in a dimly lit diner far from home, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window. In that reflection, I saw not the broken man who had once wept in the darkness, but a person forged anew in the fires of retribution. I knew that true strength wasn't measured by the ability to forgive, but by the courage to stand tall in the aftermath of betrayal. I silently vowed that no matter how enticing the idea of reconciliation might seem to others, I would never allow myself to be vulnerable again to those who had shattered my world. In time, the shock of public humiliation faded from the headlines, replaced by a hushed murmur of gossip and regret. David, whose arrogance had once been his hallmark, disappeared into obscurity, his reputation obliterated by the scandal he'd helped create. Elise, on the other hand, struggled to rebuild a life from the wreckage of her choices. Isolated and ostracized by the very community that had once admired her, she became a cautionary tale, a living reminder that some betrayals are so deep they leave no room for redemption. I have spent years since then piecing together my shattered identity. I turned my back on family dinners filled with pitying looks and empty reassurances, and instead forged a future that was unequivocally my own. I focused on my work, on the relationships that were built on mutual respect and trust rather than obligation. I mentored those who had been hurt by betrayal, offering them a quiet strength born of my own experiences. I learned to trust again, but only in measured, deliberate doses, never allowing my heart to be so open that it could be shattered once more. There are still nights when I lie awake, the silence of my apartment filled with the echoes of memories too painful to forget. In those moments, I remind myself that every scar is a badge of honor, a testament to my survival and my refusal to be defined by the betrayals of others. I no longer yearn for forgiveness or reconciliation. I have embraced a life where the only justice that matters is the one I exact upon those who thought they could break me. I have chosen to let my actions speak for themselves, to show the world that betrayal is met not with tears, but with an unwavering resolve to rise above it. Now, as I walk the path of my reconstructed life, I do so with a quiet, unyielding confidence. I have reclaimed my narrative, piece by painstaking piece, and in doing so, I have discovered that true revenge is not a momentary burst of anger. It is a lifetime of living in defiance of those who tried to control your destiny. I refuse to be their martyr or their punching bag. I am the author of my own story, and every day I write a new chapter of resilience, determination, and unassailable truth. My journey from the depths of betrayal to the heights of self-empowerment is a reminder that while the wounds of betrayal may never fully heal, they can transform us into stronger, more determined individuals. I will never forgive Elise and David, not because I harbor a desire for endless retribution, but because forgiveness in their case would mean surrendering the hard-fought power I reclaimed when I exposed their deceit. I have learned that some actions are so unforgivable that the only true response is to live a life defined by justice, strength, and an unwavering commitment to one's own worth. Even now, as I reflect on those dark months that once threatened to consume me, I stand resolute. I have turned betrayal into a weapon against those who sought to destroy my life, and in that transformation, I found a power I never knew existed. My scars, my memories, and every act of retribution form the mosaic of a life rebuilt on my own terms, A life where the only allegiance is to the truth and to the strength that rises from its depths. I share this story not to seek pity or to glorify revenge, but to remind anyone who has ever been betrayed that you are not defined by the actions of those who hurt you. Stand tall, fight back, and know that true justice lies not in forgiveness, but in the relentless pursuit of reclaiming your life. My story is a testament to that truth, a chronicle of how I turned my darkest moment into the catalyst for a future that is unequivocally mine. Looking ahead, I remain ever vigilant, knowing that the journey of self-reclamation is never truly complete. But with each passing day, I build on the foundation of the hard-won lessons that betrayal taught me. I have learned to honor the pain without letting it control me, to acknowledge my past without being imprisoned by it. I have chosen to live with purpose, to let every breath remind me that even in the wake of unspeakable betrayal, I can forge a life defined by resilience, truth, and an unwavering commitment to my own worth. I will never allow the ghosts of yesterday to dictate the promise of tomorrow. Instead, I choose to walk forward with the strength of a man who has faced the abyss and emerged unbroken, a testament to the enduring power of self-determination. This is my truth, raw and unfiltered, a reminder that while betrayal may scar us, it can never extinguish the fire that burns within when we choose to reclaim our lives on our own terms. And so, I continue each day with a quiet confidence and an unyielding resolve to never again be made a victim of betrayal. I have transformed my pain into a force for justice and a legacy of strength, a legacy that, no matter how dark the past may have been, shines as a beacon of hope for anyone who dares to rise above it. I never expected to see my parents again, at least not in any real capacity. I'd cut them off 8 years ago when I was 22, and I thought they'd be more than happy to let me stay gone. My father once told me, in front of the whole family, that I was a mistake he wished he could forget. My mother stayed silent, and when I looked at her for any sign of protest, she stared at the floor. I remember that day so vividly because it was the moment I realized nothing I did would ever measure up to my sister's achievements or my brother's effortless popularity. They always had shining report cards, sports trophies, or glamorous life updates to share, while I struggled to find my footing. I was always the weird kid who liked to tinker with old electronics, write short stories, and watch documentaries. My parents never saw that as valuable. They called me the dreamer with a sneer. In high school, I tried to fit in by picking up a sport, soccer, and I nearly ruined my knee. I tried to join the math club, but that brought me exactly 0 approval. In the end, I gave up on their praise because it felt impossible to attain. My sister, Karina, had a plan from the time she was 10. She wanted to go to medical school, marry someone equally driven, and create a thriving lifestyle. She managed the first part with ease. By the time she was in her residency, she was already engaged to a wealthy cardiologist. My parents adored her success. They told everyone how proud they were of her. Whenever I was around, they made me feel like I was there to fill some silent quota. Yes, they had another child, but no one needed to pay attention to me. My older brother, Kyle, was the popular one. He played football throughout high school, dated the head cheerleader, and graduated with a business degree. He bragged about partying with influential people and always seemed on the verge of the next big deal, though in truth, he was mostly blowing hot air. Still, it didn't matter. He was charismatic, always knew the right things to say, and had that glow that made people see potential in him whether he delivered or not. My parents adored him too, even when his business ventures flopped or teetered on the edge of legality. In contrast, I graduated college with a degree in English. I didn't walk during the ceremony because my parents said it was a waste of time. I taught for a couple of years, then realized I hated being stuck in a bureaucratic school system. Eventually, I found a niche doing technical writing at a small startup, which let me merge my love of technology with my skill at explaining concepts in clear language. It didn't pay as well as I would have liked, but at least I found a measure of fulfillment. None of that mattered to my parents. They'd corner me at every family gathering, telling me to get a real job or do something that actually mattered. No matter how often I tried to explain what I did, they tuned me out. I tried to get them interested in the fact that my startup was on the verge of releasing a new consumer product, or that I was leading a small team. They'd barely nod and then pivot back to my siblings' successes. The final straw came at Karina's wedding when my father cornered me after the ceremony. Everyone else was in high spirits. My mother was beaming, Karina was glowing in her perfect lace dress, and Kyle was charming everyone at the open bar. Then my father approached me with a glass of champagne in hand. He muttered that I'd better not embarrass anyone tonight or cause any unnecessary drama. That was all he said. He didn't thank me for flying in. He didn't notice I'd saved for weeks just to afford a decent outfit and a plane ticket. Instead, he insinuated that my presence was a liability. At the reception, he toasted Karina for being the pride of the family. He praised Kyle for his connections, his hustle, and his fearless approach to life. I was never mentioned. When Karina threw the bouquet, she teased me in front of everyone that maybe if I caught it, I'd finally have a good reason to get my act together. People laughed politely, but that moment was seared into my heart as the final humiliation. I left before the cake was served. I whispered an apology to a couple of distant cousins on my way out, but that was it. I wish I could say I had a rousing speech prepared for the moment I decided to cut contact, but all I did was draft a short email the next week stating that I needed space. I didn't blame them in the letter. I just said I was tired of pretending I had a place in the family. I wrote that I planned to focus on my own path, and I asked them not to reach out until they could show me genuine respect. My mother replied with a short note that essentially said, "We'll see you when you're done pouting." I blocked them on social media after that. For 8 long years, I navigated adulthood on my own. It was lonely at times, but I found friends who became my real support system. Eventually, I got a better paying position at a larger company. I moved to a modest, comfortable apartment and saved up enough to travel occasionally. I started seeing a wonderful partner named Danny, and for once, I experienced what it felt like to be truly seen. We built a life together that revolved around mutual encouragement, small joys, and honest conversations. I had no regrets about distancing myself from the family that never wanted me around. Life was calm until my grandpa's 80th birthday. He was the only one in the family who had ever treated me with genuine warmth. Back in the day, he would drive me to secondhand stores so we could pick up old electronics to tinker with. He'd let me wander around libraries for hours because he said reading was the best way to invest in my mind. When I dropped out of playing soccer, he was the only one who bothered to call and check in. He told me that being different was the best gift I could give myself because life would never be boring. I loved him for that. When I cut off my parents, he was the only family member who continued to send me postcards. He respected my boundaries, though, and never brought up my parents. Sometimes he'd scribble something like, "Hope you're finding happiness," and that would be that. I treasured every note. When I heard from one of my cousins that Grandpa's 80th birthday was approaching, I felt torn. I wanted to see him, but I worried about the possibility of running into my parents, sister, and brother. My cousin swore it would be a casual gathering at Grandpa's favorite restaurant. He also told me that my parents had barely been in touch with Grandpa in recent years, so they might not even show. Grandpa was living in a retirement community near the restaurant, and my cousin doubted my parents would make the flight. But he insisted Grandpa would be thrilled to see me. I went back and forth in my head, but eventually I decided I'd regret missing it. My grandpa deserved a celebration surrounded by people who loved him, and I refused to let my parents' potential presence stop me. Danny and I planned a quick weekend trip. We booked a hotel near the restaurant, figuring that if things got uncomfortable, we could leave immediately without fuss. When we arrived, I was relieved to see Grandpa's enormous grin. He looked older, yes, but his eyes still had that mischievous sparkle. He greeted me with a big hug, ignoring his walker as he leaned forward. He patted my cheek and said, "About time I saw your face again, kiddo." I felt a lump in my throat. Even though I had kept in touch through postcards, I hadn't been physically in his presence for years. He introduced me to some of his friends from the retirement community. Danny charmed them with her easy smile and warm conversation. I could see Grandpa's pride as he looked between the two of us. For the first hour or so, it was perfect. There were about 20 guests, including cousins I hadn't seen since they were in high school. Everyone mingled, nibbled on appetizers, and laughed at Grandpa's anecdotes about his younger days. Then I saw my mother walk in, followed by my father, Karina, and Kyle. I felt Danny squeeze my hand. My parents spotted me immediately, and I watched my father's expression freeze. Karina looked momentarily rattled, then plastered on that fake grin she'd perfected. My mother did a quick sweep of the room, then turned her head away from me as if I wasn't worth acknowledging. Kyle hung back. He gave me a small nod, but it felt more like a guarded gesture than a real greeting. I nodded back, mostly for Grandpa's sake, because I didn't want any drama on his big day. They settled at a separate table. The restaurant was mostly private for the evening, so we had the main dining area to ourselves, but there were enough people to keep some distance. I tried to focus on Grandpa, who was telling me about the new book he was writing. Yes, at 80, he was still writing. When my father came over, I braced myself for a confrontational sneer or a patronizing remark. Instead, he just said, "I see you're still with her." The tone of his voice made it clear he didn't approve. I forced a polite smile and introduced Danny anyway. She was gracious. My father gave a tight nod and drifted back to join my mother. They began whispering among themselves. Before dinner was served, Grandpa wanted to toast with a bit of sparkling cider. He thanked everyone for coming, told a few funny stories, and then raised his glass in my direction. He said, "I'm glad to have my granddaughter here. She's the one who always remembers to call me on holidays, even if we can't speak long. I admire her for finding her own way." The warmth in his voice almost made me tear up. I saw my mother's jaw tighten. The rest of the crowd cheered politely. Grandpa ended the toast, and dinner began. Danny and I took our seats near Grandpa, chatting with him and a couple of my cousins. I stole a glance at my parents' table. They looked aggravated, probably because they'd come expecting to be the center of attention. Karina kept flipping her hair and scanning the room as if waiting for someone more important to talk to. Kyle appeared uninterested in anything but his phone. My father's expression was sour, and my mother glared at me whenever I dared glance over. Fine, I thought, let's just get through this meal. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to find the restroom. As I headed down the hallway, I felt a hand clamp around my arm. I whirled around to see my mother, her lips pressed together, her eyes lit with something akin to fury. She hissed, "Why are you here?" I told her calmly that Grandpa had invited me. She scoffed and said, "Don't pretend you actually care about him. You just want to make some scene and embarrass us." I stared at her, astonished at how she could twist everything into an attack on them. I reminded her that I hadn't seen them in 8 years. I had no reason or desire to cause a scene at Grandpa's birthday party. He was the only reason I was present. She responded that they'd planned on having a nice family reunion for Grandpa and that I was spoiling the atmosphere with my presence. She demanded I leave quietly so that the rest of them could celebrate properly. I told her that Grandpa wanted me here, that I wasn't going anywhere, and that if she had an issue, she should speak directly to him. She looked at me with such disdain that my stomach lurched. She walked off in a huff. I tried to let it go. Grandpa was the priority. I dried my hands, took a moment to compose myself, and returned to the table. Danny asked if everything was okay. I lied and said yes. When dessert arrived, Grandpa was thrilled. The restaurant staff had arranged a special cake, and he looked like an excited kid when they brought it out. Everyone sang, snapping pictures. I hoped that would be the end of the tension, but my parents had other plans. My mother motioned for the servers to wait, then she stood up. She announced that she had prepared a little tribute. I braced myself, but she didn't mention Grandpa at all. She launched into some speech about how proud she was of her loving family, naming Karina's recent accomplishments and Kyle's expansions in his so-called business. My father chimed in, stating that they had always been a tight-knit unit and how wonderful it was that everyone who mattered could be there to show Grandpa how supportive they were. It was painfully obvious that they were excluding me. Grandpa looked baffled. I felt anger spike, but I kept quiet for his sake. After her self-serving toast, my mother reached out toward me with a dramatic flourish. She said something like, "Despite the challenges, maybe our entire family can heal if we work together. Some people need to learn how to respect their elders, and perhaps by leaving now, certain disruptions could be avoided." Her meaning was crystal clear. I felt my hands clench into fists. At that moment, Grandpa sputtered, "Enough! This is my birthday!" But my mother pressed on, her voice dripping with false piety. She claimed I'd already caused too many upsets in the past. So if I really cared about Grandpa, I would politely step aside and let them have their peace. I was torn between standing up for myself and wanting to prevent a blowout in front of Grandpa. The guests were shifting uncomfortably. Some stared at their plates, trying to avoid the tension. Danny was about to speak up, but I placed my hand on hers. Something in me snapped, and I realized I'd had enough of their nonsense. I stood slowly, locked eyes with my mother, and told her she had no right to demand anything. I was invited here by the guest of honor himself, and no one had the authority to throw me out. I reminded her that she had made her feelings about me clear my entire life, and she didn't get to rewrite that history tonight. My father slammed his fist on the table. He declared that this was their family event, and if I had any shred of decency, I would leave. Grandpa insisted, "She's my granddaughter, she's staying." My mother tried to argue that Grandpa didn't need any more stress at his age, that I was making him upset, and that the only reason he tolerated my presence was that he felt sorry for me. I saw Grandpa's face go red. He opened his mouth to retort, but I touched his arm and quietly asked if we could talk in private. The rest of the room watched, and there was an awful hush. Grandpa nodded, and we walked carefully to a side area, leaving the rest of them to stew. Danny stayed back, presumably to keep watch over the situation. I asked Grandpa if he truly wanted me there, or if I was just imposing. He frowned and looked offended that I'd even question it. He apologized for how my parents were acting. He said he was disappointed in them. He wanted me at his party because he missed me, and because I was still family in his eyes. I felt a wave of gratitude, but then that old anger, no, more like devastation, resurfaced. I didn't understand how they could treat him like a prop while overshadowing his special day with their petty drama. He told me to stay, asked me not to let them drive me away. I promised I'd do my best not to cause any more chaos in front of him, but if they pushed, I wouldn't just meekly walk away. Grandpa sighed, nodded, and squeezed my hand. We returned to the dining area only to see my father whispering into the ear of the manager, who looked thoroughly uncomfortable. The manager approached Grandpa and me, wringing his hands. He told Grandpa that he'd received a complaint from some of the hosts and asked if we could resolve the conflict or maybe continue the celebration at home. Grandpa looked furious. He insisted that he had reserved the entire restaurant space for the night, that he was the one paying, and that nobody had the right to uninvite his granddaughter. The manager looked apologetic, but he admitted that he was under the impression my father was the one footing the bill. Grandpa shook his head in disbelief and said, "I'm covering everything." It turned out my parents had tried to intercept the payment, possibly so they'd have the authority to say who could stay. Grandpa clarified that he was paying, that he'd already put down a deposit, and that there was no question about who was hosting. The manager eventually backed off, but you could feel the tension in the air. My mother gave me a look that said, "This isn't over." I decided then and there that I was done tiptoeing. I might have left it at that, but I saw Karina smirk like she was sure they'd find some way to bully me out. My father marched up to me and demanded I show some respect, told me to honor their family structure. I told him, "I'm showing respect to the only family member who ever treated me decently, Grandpa." Maybe I shouldn't have said that in front of everyone, but I was done. My father got even angrier, and if Grandpa hadn't been present, I suspect he would have thrown a punch. Danny stepped in and calmly said, "We're going to finish celebrating with Grandpa. You don't have to like it, but that's how it is." My mother spat that I had never contributed anything to the family, that I was a disappointment from birth, and that seeing me there soured the evening. She even tried to enlist Karina's help. Karina stood and in a sickeningly sweet tone told everyone that I had always been jealous of her and that maybe if I'd tried harder, my parents wouldn't resent me so much. That stung more than I care to admit. I glared at her and said, "You have no idea what it's like to grow up knowing you'll never be enough. That's why I left." Karina rolled her eyes and said something about me playing the victim. She told me to go sulk somewhere else. At that, Grandpa snapped. He told them all to leave if they couldn't handle me being there. He reminded them it was his day, that I was staying, and that he wouldn't tolerate any more insults. My father started to speak, but Grandpa roared, "I said enough!" There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Karina and Kyle muttered something about stepping outside for air. My parents followed them. The rest of us tried to salvage the party by cutting the cake and sharing stories. People were visibly uncomfortable, but Grandpa did his best to lighten the atmosphere. Danny and I helped him open presents and took pictures with him. He gave me a thumbs up whenever we locked eyes, as if to reassure me. Some of Grandpa's friends were murmuring about how unbelievably rude my parents had been. That gave me a twisted sense of validation. Maybe I wasn't crazy for feeling unloved by them all these years. Once we'd had our fill of cake, Grandpa sat back, looking exhausted. I was about to suggest calling it a night when Karina burst back in, eyes shining with a triumphant look. She said, "We've sorted everything out. It's time for you to go, Jade." I noticed the restaurant manager standing behind her. He looked exasperated, but he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a check that clearly came from my father, the amount blank, with a note reading, "Name your price to leave." My heart pounded in disbelief. They were literally trying to pay me off to go away. The manager explained that he was just the messenger, that he was uncomfortable but had been told there would be trouble if I stayed. Grandpa tried to stand up, but I told him to rest. I waved the check in the air and asked my parents, "Is this how you handle things now? You just pay people to disappear?" My mother said, "You've always chased money, so we thought it was the best solution. Take it and go." I almost laughed. Chased money? I'd been living on a modest salary, building my life with no help from them, never asking for a dime. I calmly ripped the check into pieces and dropped them on the floor. A hush fell. Then Karina shrieked, "How dare you!" She acted like I just insulted them beyond measure. I told them, "I don't want your filthy bribe. I'm here for Grandpa." That's when my parents tried a different tactic. They started telling the manager that I was threatening them. They claimed I was dangerous, that I had been violent in the past, which was a blatant lie. They demanded he call the police to have me removed. The manager was stuck in an impossible position. Finally, Grandpa's voice rose again, trembling with anger. He barked at the manager that none of it was true, that he could call the retirement community staff and verify Grandpa was the actual client who booked the party, and that the deposit came from Grandpa's own account. Reluctantly, the manager said he believed Grandpa. But my parents kept pressing. They said Grandpa was old and confused, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he was being manipulated by me. That's when I saw tears form in Grandpa's eyes. I realized how their manipulations had run deep for years, not just toward me, but toward anyone they could control, even Grandpa, if it served their agenda. I locked eyes with Grandpa. He gave me a faint nod, as if to say it was time to stop letting them treat him like this. I said to my parents, "You're liars, you're manipulators, and if you think for 1 second that I will let you walk all over Grandpa, you're sorely mistaken." Kyle stepped forward then. He said, "I always knew you were trouble." I snapped back that if trouble meant refusing to be their punching bag, I was proud to be labeled that. Karina called me an ungrateful brat. I retorted that ungrateful was better than being toxic. My mother demanded I leave, or she'd have the police drag me out. I felt my pulse hammer, but before I could respond, the manager sighed and said, "You all need to leave the restaurant. This is too disruptive." Grandpa pleaded with him, reminding him that it was his birthday. The manager apologized, but insisted that the atmosphere was too hostile and that he couldn't risk further confrontation. He asked us all to go. My parents smirked, thinking they'd won, but Grandpa signaled to me and Danny to help him gather his gifts. He said, "We're going to my house. Jade, please come." So we did. The rest of the guests followed. My parents started ordering Karina and Kyle to gather everyone, but nobody listened. People simply picked up their things and left. It felt like we were migrating away from my parents' negativity, forming a silent pact not to let them ruin the evening further. Outside, Grandpa leaned on his walker. My parents approached one last time. My father hissed, "Don't think this is over," and my mother called me a disgrace. Then Karina pushed forward, jabbing a finger at my chest, saying if I had any self-respect, I'd get lost and let the real family handle Grandpa from now on. I stared her down. I told her to keep her distance, or she'd regret it. She shrugged that off, flipping her hair like she always did when she felt superior. We bundled Grandpa into Danny's car. My parents and siblings started yelling about how I shouldn't drive him anywhere, but Grandpa had already slammed the door, telling me, "Let's just go." A small group of relatives followed in their own cars. We went to Grandpa's place and settled into his cozy living room. The older folks were exhausted and went to bed soon after. My parents didn't have a key to Grandpa's place, and the retirement community had a security gate, so we felt safe from an immediate ambush. Grandpa was still steaming. He apologized repeatedly for how the night had spiraled, but I assured him it wasn't his fault. I told him I was sorry for the tension. He patted my hand and said, "I'm proud of you for standing your ground." We stayed up talking about old times until he grew too tired to keep his eyes open. I decided we'd get a good night's sleep and figure out next steps in the morning. The next day, Grandpa told me about something my parents had done a while back. They'd tried to move him into a less expensive facility against his will. They had no power of attorney, but they kept pressuring him. He suspected they wanted to save money by forcing him somewhere cheaper. I felt rage simmering in my veins. I'd believed my parents had simply ignored Grandpa all these years, but it turned out they'd been circling like vultures, wanting to claim his assets. Grandpa said he'd been receiving calls from Karina and Kyle, hinting that it was time for Grandpa to distribute certain funds so they could invest in business opportunities or pay for expansions in their lavish lifestyles. Grandpa said he didn't owe them a thing. Then he dropped the real bomb. He intended to leave everything to me. I was stunned. I told him I appreciated the gesture, but that I didn't want to cause more drama. Grandpa said it was his decision, and the only drama was coming from the ones who felt entitled to his money. He insisted he wanted to protect me too, because he suspected they'd come after me eventually. Over the following weeks, Grandpa worked with his lawyer to finalize everything. He told me that he'd wanted to do this for a while, but had hesitated, hoping his kids might develop some decency. Instead, they tried to bulldoze him at his own birthday party. I stayed with him during that time, helping him with errands, enjoying his company. Danny returned to work, but visited when she could. The retirement community staff was kind, and they adored Grandpa, which reinforced my belief that he was where he wanted to be. My parents tried calling, demanding to know where Grandpa was. He refused to speak to them. Karina left me furious voicemails. Kyle tried to act suave, claiming he just wanted to talk. We ignored them all. When the will was set, Grandpa invited them for a family meeting plus a few extended relatives. He said he wanted everything in the open. I was nervous, but Grandpa insisted. He was done letting them walk all over him. The meeting took place in the retirement community's lounge. My parents arrived, looking smug, probably expecting Grandpa to placate them. Karina and Kyle showed up with forced smiles, greeting everyone as though nothing had happened. The lawyer opened the meeting by stating Grandpa's final wishes. When my parents realized Grandpa was leaving the bulk of his estate to me, their outrage filled the room. My father shouted that this was elder abuse, that I had manipulated Grandpa. My mother threatened to sue. Karina shrieked that I had always been jealous and was now stealing from them. Kyle tried to argue that Grandpa must be losing his faculties, but Grandpa remained calm. He told them plainly that nobody was losing anything they deserved. He said he was dividing small portions among them, but that the majority would go to me. My parents exploded, but the lawyer laid out everything in black and white, explaining how Grandpa was mentally competent and had the right to allocate his assets as he pleased. That's when my mother lunged toward me, hurling accusations that I had planned all of this. She ranted that I'd deliberately shown up after 8 years to isolate Grandpa. She demanded I confess that I was just waiting for him to die so I could get my hands on his money. I looked her in the eye and told her she was projecting her own intentions onto me. Karina started pointing a finger in my face, calling me names, spitting venom. My father said he'd fight me in court until I had nothing left. He threatened that I'd regret stealing from them. I felt a renewed surge of that old, helpless hurt. Then I remembered all the nights I'd cried, all the humiliations, all the times they'd written me off as worthless. They had done nothing but demean me. If they wanted a war, I was prepared to see it through. The lawyer calmly explained that any legal challenge would be futile. Grandpa had documented everything meticulously, and a doctor had verified his sound mind just days before. Still, my parents raged. They tried to intimidate Grandpa into changing his mind. I watched as Karina tried to guilt-trip him with tears, telling him how she saved lives for a living, how she was the real achiever in the family. Grandpa wasn't moved. Kyle bragged about his big business deals and how much he could do with Grandpa's inheritance. Grandpa reminded him that he never saw any results from Kyle's big talk. Then Grandpa turned to my parents, told them he'd loved them once, but that they'd abandoned any sense of decency. He told them he was ashamed of their behavior. I almost cried hearing him say that, but I kept my composure. I expected a lawsuit. Instead, they tried to corner me outside the lounge, insisting we talk. They offered me a deal. If I refused Grandpa's inheritance and signed it over to them, they'd let me remain in the family. The absurdity of that offer stunned me. I told them I had no desire to be part of their toxic circle. My mother said, "Then you'll watch your back." I stared her down and replied, "I've been watching it for years, thanks to you." They saw I was serious. We parted ways that day, and they left in a cloud of threats. Grandpa passed a couple of years later, peacefully. I was heartbroken, but I was there holding his hand. He left me everything as promised. My parents tried one last stunt, claiming Grandpa's will had been forged, but the courts threw their case out. They never apologized, never admitted to any wrongdoing. They hated me with renewed vigor. For a moment, I considered bridging the gap, if only to pay tribute to Grandpa's memory. But then I remembered every humiliation, every insult, the attempt to bribe me to leave his birthday party. They'd never once shown remorse. I felt no obligation to forgive. I made sure everything Grandpa left me was placed in investments he would have approved of, including a scholarship fund for underprivileged students who wanted to study engineering or technology, something that aligned with what Grandpa used to encourage in me. My parents tried to hound me for a piece of that fund, but I had my own lawyer by then, and I refused all their demands. In the end, Karina's life took a downturn as she racked up debt from a failed private clinic project. Kyle got entangled in lawsuits over shady businesses. My parents tried to spin a story that I had robbed them of resources they needed to help Kyle and Karina out of their crises. But nobody bought that tale. Extended family members saw how they treated Grandpa at his own birthday celebration, how they tried to pay me off, how they insulted him in the final months of his life. Their reputations were ruined among people who actually mattered. I stayed out of their orbit. They reached out once, ironically, to see if I might consider sharing resources to help Kyle. I almost laughed. Instead, I sent a brief note informing them that the only reason I'd reply was to make my answer clear. Never contact me again. Some might say revenge is never satisfying, but in this case, it was just and it was final. They'd labeled me the family failure, dismissed me for years, then tried to bar me from my own grandpa's birthday celebration. They lost, and I have no sympathy for them. If they had shown even an ounce of genuine remorse or love for Grandpa, maybe things would have been different. But they sealed their own fate. Grandpa's legacy lives on in the scholarship fund and in my heart. Whenever I see a student tinkering with an old circuit board or writing an unconventional project proposal, I think of him and smile. I'm proud to say I turned out just fine without my parents' approval. I found success, built a circle of supportive friends, married Danny, and honored Grandpa's memory by passing on his kindness to those who deserve it. Meanwhile, my parents remain trapped in the misery they created for themselves. It still astonishes me how far they were willing to go to erase me. They never expected Grandpa to see through their manipulations. But he did, and he ensured that the only person who bothered to treat him well in the later years was the one rewarded in the end. People ask if I'd ever forgive them. Absolutely not. They didn't just hurt me, they tormented Grandpa when he was vulnerable. I have no room in my life for that kind of hatred. Grandpa taught me that not all family is worth keeping. It took me years to realize, but he was right. Freeing myself from them was the best decision I ever made. They can't touch me now, and I owe them nothing. I'm sharing this because I want people to know they're not obligated to forgive those who betray them. Sometimes, cutting ties and living a better life is the only valid option. I learned that once someone shows you who they are, you should believe them. My parents showed me repeatedly that they were cruel, manipulative, and incapable of love unless it served them. Trying to please them would have only destroyed my own happiness. Walking away didn't make me the bad guy. It allowed me to protect what little self-worth I had left. The irony is that in walking away, I found genuine love and ended up with the inheritance they coveted. It wasn't about the money, it was about knowing that Grandpa believed in me, saw my worth, and stood up for me when nobody else did. That, more than any financial windfall, is what truly matters. I still remember the last words Grandpa said to me before he passed. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did good, kiddo." I carry that with me every day. Even though my parents never believed I could amount to anything, Grandpa did. That validation was priceless, especially given how starved I had been for acceptance. It was also a reminder that I didn't need my parents' approval or forgiveness. All I needed was to believe in my own worth, surround myself with people who cared, and let the rest crumble on its own. My parents' betrayal might have once broken me, but their attempt to kick me out of Grandpa's celebration was the catalyst that freed me completely from their toxic grip. I hope they think of that moment whenever they feel entitled to something they never earned. I hope they remember my face when I tore that blank check in half. There was no reconciliation, no heartfelt apologies. Only consequences for their actions and the knowledge that I have no regrets about how it all ended. Sometimes, the best revenge is living the life they insisted you could never have, and I'm doing exactly that.